The knights had a code. That was what Part 1 left behind, not just the ruins of Rome, not just the empire that Charlemagne had tried to rebuild, not just the castles and the feudal contracts, and the elaborate ceremonies of homage and loyalty. What the first 3 centuries of the medieval world had produced, above everything else, was an idea. The idea that violence could be directed. That the sword could serve something larger than the man who held it. That a warrior could be, simultaneously, a Christian, could kill and pray, could fight and be forgiven, could dedicate his courage and his cruelty to the glory of God. The Church had been working on this problem for 200 years. The peace of God. The truce of God. The careful theological architecture of just war theory, inherited from Augustine and refined by generations of bishops who understood that the warrior class was not going away and that the only realistic option was to shape it. Slowly, imperfectly, with enormous resistance and constant backsliding, something like a moral framework had been built around the violence of the knightly world. And then, in the autumn of 1095, a pope stood up in a field in France and offered the knights of Europe something none of the careful theologians had quite dared to offer before. Not restraint. Not limitation. Not the careful negotiation of when and how and against whom violence was permissible. He offered them a war. A holy war. A war in which the killing was not merely excused but sanctified. A war in which dying was not a tragedy but a martyrdom. A war that would take all the restless, dangerous, barely contained violence of the knightly class and point it, finally, completely, with the full authority of God's representative on earth, toward a single target. Go to Jerusalem. The crowd roared. And in that roar, in that single moment when a field full of armed men suddenly understood that everything they were, everything that made them dangerous and feared and slightly shameful in the eyes of the church they served, was suddenly not just acceptable but required, the medieval world made its most consequential decision. It decided to march. What followed would last nearly 200 years. It would reshape the Mediterranean, transform European commerce, poison the relationship between Christianity and Islam in ways that have not finished reverberating, and reveal, with a clarity that no amount of chivalric poetry could obscure, the distance between what the medieval world said it was and what it actually was when the restraints came off and God's endorsement was secure. This is the story of the Crusades. It does not have a simple moral. It does not resolve into a clean lesson about faith or violence, or the uses of religious conviction. It is too large for that, too contradictory, too human in all the ways that humanity is both magnificent and terrible. But it begins, as so many of the medieval world's defining moments begin, with a problem that needed solving. And the problem, in 1095, was Jerusalem. To understand why Urban II's call produced the response it did, you have to understand what Jerusalem meant. Not politically. Not strategically. Those dimensions existed and mattered, but they were not what sent 200,000 people stumbling across 3,000 miles of hostile terrain toward a city most of them had never seen and would never have visited under any other circumstances. Jerusalem meant something that is difficult to fully recover across the distance of 1,000 years, something that has to do with the particular texture of medieval Christian faith, its concreteness, its insistence on the physical reality of sacred history. The medieval Christian did not experience his faith primarily as a set of abstract propositions. He experienced it as a story that had happened in real places. Places that still existed, that could be touched, that retained something of the sacred energy of the events that had occurred there. The stone on which Christ had been laid after the crucifixion. The hill where the cross had stood. The tomb from which he had risen. These were not symbols. They were locations. Physical, specific, visitable locations that connected the believer, through the medium of space rather than time, to the moment of salvation. To a medieval Christian, pilgrimage to Jerusalem was not tourism. It was something closer to touching the hem of God's garment. And the idea that these places, these irreplaceable, sacred, unrepeatable places, were in the hands of people who did not share the faith, who could restrict access or desecrate the sites or simply be there, occupying the holiest geography in the world without the reverence it demanded. This idea produced an anxiety that had been building in the Christian West for decades before Urban gave it a name and a direction. The political context was real and urgent. The Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos had sent an embassy to the Council of Piacenza earlier in 1095, requesting military assistance against the Seljuk Turks who had shattered his army at Manzikert in 1071 and were steadily consuming the Anatolian heartland of his empire. Alexios wanted mercenaries, experienced Western fighters who could reinforce Byzantine armies, fight under Byzantine command, be paid and dismissed when the immediate crisis was resolved. He was a careful, pragmatic man, and he understood exactly what he was asking for. He did not understand what he was about to receive. Pope Urban II was not a foolish man. He was one of the most politically sophisticated popes of the entire medieval period, a reformer, an administrator, a man who understood the levers of power in the ecclesiastical and secular worlds with unusual clarity. When he stood up at Clermont on November 27, 1095, he was not simply responding to Alexios's request. He was seizing an opportunity. The papacy had spent the previous 50 years locked in a bitter struggle with the Holy Roman Emperors over the question of who had the right to appoint bishops. The investiture controversy, one of the defining political conflicts of the high medieval period. The papacy had claimed, and largely won, the principle that spiritual authority was independent of and superior to secular authority. Urban wanted to consolidate that victory. A successful crusade, a massive military enterprise organized and blessed by the Pope, that rescued the Eastern Church, recovered Jerusalem, and demonstrated that the papacy could mobilize the entire military capacity of Christian Europe, would be the ultimate demonstration of papal power. It would make the Pope, functionally, the commander-in-chief of Christendom. And there was another calculation. The Knights of Europe were a problem. They were always a problem, violent, restless, constantly fighting each other, raiding each other's lands, terrorizing the peasant populations that were the economic foundation of everything. The peace of God and the truce of God had helped, marginally. A crusade would help more. It would take the most dangerous men in Europe and point them outward. He stood before the crowd at Clermont, and he spoke. We do not have his exact words. The speech was recorded by several chroniclers, none of whom were present, all of whom wrote their accounts years afterward, and all of whom gave different versions. What we have is the effect. He told them the Holy Land was suffering. He told them pilgrims were being mistreated. He was not precise about the details, and the details were not always accurate. He told them their brothers in the East were calling for help. He told them that their fighting here, among themselves, for petty prizes in a petty world, was sinful, and that God was offering them a chance at redemption. Take the cross. March to Jerusalem. Fight for the Holy Sepulchre. And all your sins, all of them, the accumulated weight of a lifetime of violence, will be forgiven. 3 times the crowd shouted back at him in Latin. Deus Vult. God wills it. The Crusades had begun. The first wave was not the armies of the great lords. It was something stranger and more terrible, a mass movement of the poor, the desperate, the genuinely devout, the apocalyptically hopeful. A preacher named Peter the Hermit had been traveling through France and the Rhineland for months before Clermont, preaching the liberation of Jerusalem with a charisma so raw and so compelling that tens of thousands of people, peasants, minor clergy, women, children, men who owned nothing and had nothing to lose, began to follow him. Peter was small and thin and by all accounts unwashed, riding a donkey instead of a horse, wearing a hair shirt, allegedly exuding a fragrance that his followers interpreted as evidence of holiness. whether what they smelled was holiness is open to interpretation. What is not open to interpretation is the extraordinary power he had over crowds. People tore pieces from his clothing as relics. They wept when he preached. They sold everything they owned and joined his procession east, carrying crosses and singing hymns, genuinely believing that God would provide food, weapons, victory, whatever they needed along the way. They called this the People's Crusade. Historians would later call it a catastrophe in embryo. It began going wrong almost immediately. Moving through the Rhineland in the spring of 1096, the People's Crusade encountered Jewish communities and the logic, if logic is the right word for what was essentially hysteria feeding on greed, feeding on genuine theological confusion, became quickly murderous. We are marching to avenge the suffering of Christ. Jerusalem is held by his enemies. But here, in our own cities, are also enemies of Christ, people who rejected him, whose ancestors killed him. Why march 3,000 miles when the infidel lives next door? The massacres that followed, in Speyer, Worms, Mainz, Cologne, and other Rhineland cities, killed thousands of Jewish people in weeks. Some communities chose collective death over forced conversion, a horror recorded in Jewish chronicles with a grief that still resonates across 9 centuries. Bishops tried to intervene, offering shelter within cathedral precincts, threatening the Crusaders with excommunication. Some Jews were saved. Most were not. The Crusaders killed anyway, and moved on, and sang hymns as they went. It was the first major organized anti-Jewish massacre in European history. It would not be the last. Every subsequent crusade would produce its own wave of violence against Jewish communities, the pattern established in 1096 repeating with terrible regularity whenever religious enthusiasm reached a certain pitch, and the normal restraints of civil order were suspended in the name of holy purpose. Peter the Hermit's army reached Constantinople in August 1096, having survived the march only through a combination of desperate foraging and Byzantine charity along the way. The Emperor Alexios looked at this mob, starving, undisciplined, already causing damage to his suburbs, and made the only sensible decision available to him. He fed them, organized them onto boats, crossed them to Anatolia, and strongly advised them to wait for the professional armies that were coming before engaging the Seljuk Turks. They did not wait. They advanced into Seljuk territory in October 1096 and were almost entirely destroyed at a place called Civitate. The Seljuk forces killed perhaps 15,000 people. The survivors were enslaved or fled back to the coast. Peter the Hermit had been back in Constantinople when the massacre happened, attempting to renegotiate his relationship with Alexios, which perhaps tells you something about Peter the Hermit. The People's Crusade was over. The Real Crusade was arriving. Through the autumn and winter of 1096 and into the spring of 1097, the armies of the great lords reached Constantinople by different routes, overland through the Balkans, by sea from southern Italy, across the Adriatic and down through Greece. They were not a unified force. They had no single commander, no unified strategy, no clear chain of authority. They were several separate armies who happened to be going to the same place for approximately the same reasons and who would spend the entire campaign simultaneously cooperating and competing. Godfrey of Bouillon, Duke of Lower Lorraine. His brother Baldwin. Raymond IV of Toulouse, old and genuinely pious in a way that made the younger commanders slightly uncomfortable. Bohemond of Taranto, a Norman prince from southern Italy, physically enormous, politically calculating, militarily brilliant, and transparent about his ambitions in a way that everyone found alarming and secretly admired. And 100 lesser lords with their retinues, their servants, their priests, their families, the entire apparatus of the aristocratic household relocated to the road east. Alexios received them with a mixture of profound relief and barely concealed alarm. He extracted oaths from most of them, promises that any former Byzantine territory reconquered would be returned to imperial control. most of the leaders swore. Most of them intended, from that moment, to interpret those oaths as creatively as circumstances allowed. The army crossed into Anatolia. The fighting began. And the medieval world's most consequential military adventure moved into its first act. The campaign through Anatolia in the summer of 1097 was an education in how far the Crusaders still had to go. The heat was extraordinary, a Syrian summer that killed horses and men who had trained in the cool, damp climates of northern France and the Norman south of Italy and had no idea what they were walking into. Men in full mail armor marching across the Anatolian plateau in temperatures that climbed past anything they had experienced, carrying equipment that weighed 60 pounds, drinking from water sources that were increasingly scarce as the Seljuks systematically stripped the land ahead of them. They took Nicaea in June 1097, the first major Seljuk city, which surrendered to Byzantine negotiation rather than Crusader assault, cutting the Crusaders out of the plunder they had been counting on. They fought the Seljuk cavalry at Dorylaeum in a battle that nearly destroyed the entire expedition before it had properly begun, the Turkish horsemen surrounding the Crusader vanguard and pouring arrows into them for hours, the kind of mobile archery warfare that heavily armored Frankish knights had no effective answer for, until the main army arrived and sheer weight of numbers turned the tide. They crossed the Taurus Mountains, those brutal passes where men and horses died from cold and exhaustion on the same campaign that had nearly killed them with heat 2 months earlier. And then they reached Antioch. Antioch was the key, one of the great cities of the ancient world, where Paul the Apostle had preached and the word Christian had first been used, sitting astride the routes that connected Anatolia to Syria and Syria to Jerusalem. It was surrounded by walls of extraordinary extent, built and reinforced over centuries, requiring a garrison of significant size to defend and an army of extraordinary patience to besiege. The Crusaders arrived in October 1097. 7.5 months later, they were still there. The siege of Antioch broke them and remade them. They had arrived expecting a quick resolution, a city overcome in weeks, the road to Jerusalem open before winter. What they found was a garrison that would not surrender, a city whose walls were too extensive to surround completely, a Syrian winter that they had not prepared for, and a countryside stripped of food by retreating Seljuk forces who understood exactly what they were doing. Men died by the thousands, not from battle but from hunger and disease, from the cold, from the accumulated physical destruction of a siege that went on long past the point where anyone had expected to still be sitting in front of those walls. They ate their horses. They ate roots and grass. They ate leather when there was nothing else. The chronicles record men so weakened by starvation that they could barely lift their weapons, continuing to stand watch on the siege lines because there was no one to replace them. And then a Seljuk relief army appeared behind them. Caught between the walls of Antioch and a fresh army to their rear, the Crusaders faced the real possibility of annihilation. 2 years into a journey that had already consumed a third of those who had set out, with Jerusalem still hundreds of miles away, with no possibility of retreat across the ground they had crossed, the crusading enterprise balanced on a knife edge. What happened next involved a lance, a vision, and the particular kind of desperate courage that men produce when there is genuinely nothing left to lose. A crusader named Peter Bartholomew reported a vision in which the apostle Andrew revealed to him the location of the Holy Lance, the spear that had pierced Christ's side at the crucifixion, buried beneath the floor of a church inside Antioch. At the same time, Bohemond had been secretly negotiating with an Armenian guard named Pyrrhus, who commanded one of the towers in Antioch's walls. On the night of June 2, 1098, Pyrrhus opened the tower. Crusader soldiers climbed in on ropes. The gates were opened from inside. Antioch fell on June 3, 1098. The garrison and much of the population were killed in the assault and the chaos that followed. 3 days later, the Seljuk relief army arrived. Now the Crusaders were inside the city they had just captured, with a larger army outside the walls, without enough food or water to sustain a siege of indefinite duration, in a city they had just spent 7 months trying to take by force. The irony was complete and potentially fatal. On June 28, 1098, carrying the Holy Lance at their head, whether it was genuine mattered less than what it meant to the men who carried it, the Crusaders marched out of Antioch's gates. The Seljuk commander Kerboga had been quarreling with his subordinate commanders throughout the siege. When the Crusaders charged, his coalition fractured almost immediately, his allies choosing to abandon him rather than fight for a general they distrusted. The Crusaders won a battle they had almost no right to win. Antioch was theirs. Bohemond took it for himself, Byzantine oaths forgotten, and established the Principality of Antioch, the second Crusader state, founded on the brutal pragmatism that was always the crusading enterprise's other face, behind the prayers and the pilgrim badges and the hymns. The road to Jerusalem was open. They reached it in June 1099. After 3 years. After the deaths of perhaps a third of the army that had left Europe. After the Rhineland massacres and the People's Crusades catastrophe and the starvation outside Antioch and the politics and the betrayals and the series of improbable military victories that had somehow brought them to this point. The sources agree on what happened when the Crusaders saw Jerusalem. They wept. The hardened military commanders. The veterans who had seen everything. They wept. Whether from faith or exhaustion or simple disbelief that they had actually arrived, the sources do not explain. Perhaps all three simultaneously. They were there. The city was before them. The siege lasted 5 weeks. On July 15, 1099, the Crusaders breached the walls. What followed was a massacre. The Muslim and Jewish inhabitants of Jerusalem were killed, men, women, children, in numbers that even the exaggerated chronicles cannot fully contain. The chronicler Raymond of Aguilers wrote of blood reaching to the knees of horses in the streets of the Temple Mount. The image is almost certainly not literally accurate. But it captures something true about what happened, not a battle, not a military operation, but a slaughter conducted by men who believed they were fulfilling God's will, who sang hymns as they killed and walked barefoot to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre afterward and wept and prayed. The First Crusade had achieved its objective. Jerusalem was in Christian hands. And the contradiction at the heart of the entire enterprise, the gap between the holy city they had come to liberate and the thing they had become in liberating it, was already visible to anyone willing to look. The Crusader states that emerged from the conquest were extraordinary and improbable things. 4 of them eventually. The county of Edessa in the north, established by Baldwin, who had detached himself from the main army and struck out for his own fortune with the pragmatism that characterized the Crusader enterprise at its most honest. The Principality of Antioch, established by Bohemond. The county of Tripoli, established by Raymond's heirs after Raymond himself died before seeing his dream realized. And at the center, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the largest and most prestigious, governed first by Godfrey of Bouillon, who refused the title of king in the city where Christ had been crowned with thorns and called himself instead advocate of the Holy Sepulchre, and then by his brother Baldwin, who had no such scruples. These states sat in the middle of a vast Islamic world. They were surrounded. Their survival depended on a continuous flow of men and supplies from Europe that could never be guaranteed, on the political divisions of their neighbors that could not be counted on to last, and on the military skill and institutional organization of the settler population that had come to stay in a land that was not theirs. The military orders were the Crusader state's most distinctive and consequential institution. The Knights Hospitaller had begun as a charitable organization, a house in Jerusalem that cared for sick pilgrims, founded before the First Crusade and transformed into a military order afterward. The Knights Templar were founded around 1119 by a small group of French knights who took monastic vows and dedicated themselves to protecting pilgrims on the roads of the Holy Land. Both organizations resolved, in institutional form, the theological problem that had always shadowed the knightly class, the problem of violence and salvation, of how a man could kill for God without damning himself. These were monks who fought. Their violence was entirely in God's service. They had renounced personal property, personal ambition, personal will, and in exchange received the extraordinary privilege of killing without moral consequence. The Templars in particular became, over the following century, one of the most powerful institutions in the Christian world. Their military effectiveness in the Holy Land was matched by a financial sophistication that outpaced anything else in medieval Europe. They developed the letter of credit, a document that allowed a pilgrim to deposit money in a Templar house in France and withdraw the equivalent amount in Jerusalem, eliminating the danger of carrying gold through 3,000 miles of hostile territory. This was, in essence, the invention of banking as the modern world understands it. The Templars became the bankers of kings. Their wealth was enormous. Their castles, Croix de Chevaliers, Chateau Pèlerin, the great fortresses of the Syrian coast, were the most formidable defensive structures of the age. But the Crusader states, for all their institutional creativity, were fighting a demographic battle they could not win. The Islamic world surrounding them was vast, occasionally fractious, but ultimately capable of unity when the right leader appeared. That leader arrived in stages, first as a young Kurdish general serving in the armies of Nur ad-Din, the ruler of Syria, then as the governor of Egypt, then as the unified sultan of both Egypt and Syria, surrounding the Crusader states from north and south simultaneously. His name in Arabic was Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub. The Crusaders called him Saladin. He was not the cartoon villain that the crusading chronicles might have made him, and he was not the perfect chivalric hero that later legend, both Islamic and, remarkably, Christian, constructed from the fragments of his biography. He was intelligent. He was tactically gifted. He was personally brave in the way that medieval commanders had to be, leading from the front, visible to his troops, sharing their risks. He was genuinely devout without the performance that sometimes masqueraded as devotion in courts where piety was politically convenient. He was capable of great generosity and also of calculated ruthlessness. The systematic execution of captured Templar and Hospitaller knights was a deliberate policy, because he had learned that ransoming them simply returned them to the battlefield. He was also patient. For nearly 20 years after he unified Egypt and Syria, Saladin probed the Crusader states, raided their territory, tested their responses, waited for the political dysfunction that he could see building within the Kingdom of Jerusalem to reach its inevitable crisis point. The kingdom in the 1180s was governed by a succession of rulers weakened by illness and minority, and the factional struggles of an aristocracy that had been arguing about everything for 3 generations. The one ruler who had shown genuine ability, the young Baldwin IV, who had ruled with extraordinary intelligence and courage while leprosy slowly consumed his body, died in 1185. His heir, a child, died within a year. The crown passed to a man named Guy of Lusignan, who was deeply unpopular with the kingdom's experienced military commanders and whose judgment, as events would shortly demonstrate, was not equal to the situation he faced. Saladin watched and waited. And in the summer of 1187, his moment arrived. The Battle of Hattin was the day the Crusader kingdom died. It did not look like a battle so much as a trap being sprung in slow motion, each decision that led to it visible in retrospect as the step it was, each warning ignored for reasons that made sense in isolation and were catastrophic in combination. Saladin crossed the Jordan River into Crusader territory in late June 1187, moving against the town of Tiberias on the Sea of Galilee, where he besieged the castle held by the wife of Raymond III of Tripoli. Raymond himself was with the main Crusader army, and Raymond, the most experienced military commander in the kingdom, a man who had spent years as Saladin's prisoner and understood his adversary better than anyone else on the Crusader side, advised against marching to relieve Tiberius. The route lay across waterless plateau in the height of summer. Saladin was almost certainly using Tiberius as bait. The army would arrive exhausted and thirsty, and in exactly the position Saladin wanted them in. Guy of Lusignan ignored the advice. He had good reasons, or reasons that sounded good in the council chamber. Tiberias was a crusader city. Its countess was asking for help. To refuse would be to demonstrate weakness, to signal to every vassal in the kingdom that the king would not defend them when Saladin struck. The political logic was coherent. The military logic was suicidal. The army marched. 20,000 men, every knight the kingdom could muster, the true cross carried among them as a sacred standard that no crusader army had ever lost in battle. Saladin's cavalry surrounded them from the moment they left their camp, harassing from every direction, cutting off access to water sources, inflicting constant casualties with archery while refusing to close to the hand-to-hand combat that the Frankish knights could win. The army marched in a bubble of violence, unable to respond effectively, unable to retreat, unable to advance quickly enough to break free. They camped that night near twin volcanic hills called the Horns of Hattin. Men and horses were desperate with thirst. They could hear running water somewhere in the darkness but could not reach it. Saladin's forces set fire to the dry grass surrounding the camp. The smoke added to the misery of a night that was already close to unbearable. The battle the next morning was less a battle than a dissolution. The infantry, maddened by thirst and panic, broke formation and climbed the Horns of Hattin, refusing to come down despite the desperate orders of their commanders. The cavalry fought on without infantry support, charging, breaking through the encircling Seljuk forces, and coming back rather than abandoning the foot soldiers, only to be surrounded again each time. The true cross was captured. The Grand Master of the Templars was captured. Guy of Lusignan himself was surrounded and taken. He was brought before Saladin. The Sultan gave him water, iced, cooled with snow from Mount Hermon, an extraordinary luxury in that heat. By the customs of the medieval Middle East, giving a prisoner water was a pledge of safety. Saladin was signaling that Guy would live. The Templar and Hospitaller knights captured in the battle received no such courtesy. 230 of them were executed the following day, killed by Saladin's religious scholars and volunteers in an act that mirrored, with terrible symmetry, the treatment of Muslim prisoners that the Crusaders had carried out at Antioch and Jerusalem nearly 90 years before. After Hattin, the coastal cities fell like dominoes. Acre, Jaffa, Ascalon, Beirut. City after city surrendering in the weeks that followed, their garrisons too depleted to resist, their populations negotiating the best terms available. On October 2nd, 1187, 88 years, 2 months, and 17 days after the First Crusade had captured Jerusalem, Saladin entered the city. He did not massacre the population. The contrast with 1099 was pointed and unmistakable. The Christian inhabitants were given 40 days to pay ransoms, 7 gold pieces for a man, 5 for a woman, 1 for a child. Those who could pay left. Those who could not were enslaved. The Patriarch of Jerusalem carried out enormous quantities of treasure from the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, claiming it was church property and therefore not subject to ransom. Saladin allowed it, though his advisors were furious. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre was not destroyed. Christian pilgrimage to Jerusalem was permitted to continue. Whether this restraint was policy or character or both, it stood in devastating contrast to what the Crusaders had done in the same. Frederick Barbarossa drowned. The greatest of the 3 rulers. The Holy Roman Emperor who had been commanding armies since before the other 2 kings were born, who had spent decades as the dominant political force in Europe, who led an army of perhaps 100,000 men across Anatolia in the largest crusading force ever assembled, crossed the Salef River in Anatolia in June 1190, and did not come out the other side. Whether he fell from his horse attempting a ford or suffered a heart attack in the current, the sources disagree. The result was the same. Without its leader, the German army collapsed. Most turned back. A remnant continued to the Holy Land and played a minor role in what followed. The greatest military force ever pointed at Jerusalem simply evaporated. Philip and Richard arrived by sea. They were not friends. They were rivals whose kingdoms had been at war for most of their adult lives, who had taken the cross together because neither could afford to go without the other and neither could afford to let the other go alone. Their cooperation during the Third Crusade was a sustained performance of controlled mutual antagonism, each man doing what the campaign required, either giving the other more credit than was absolutely unavoidable. They joined the siege of Acre, which had been underway since 1189, a crusader force besieging the city while Saladin's army besieged the besiegers, an extraordinary three-cornered military situation that had been grinding through disease and starvation and constant assault for nearly 2 years before the kings arrived. The arrival of Philip and Richard with fresh troops, siege engines, and naval support was decisive. Acre fell on July 12, 1191. Philip left almost immediately. He had done what honor required. There were more pressing matters at home, specifically, the opportunity to move against Richard's territories in France while Richard was occupied fighting a holy war on the other side of the Mediterranean. The calculation was cynical and completely transparent, and Philip made it without visible embarrassment. Richard stayed. Whatever Richard I of England was as a king, and as a king of England he was largely absent, spoke no English, regarded his kingdom primarily as a revenue source for his wars, and left it to be governed by regents through most of his reign. On a battlefield he was something close to extraordinary. The march from Acre south along the coast toward Jerusalem in the late summer of 1191 is still studied in military academies. Richard moved his army in a formation of such disciplined precision that Saladin could not break it despite constant, sustained harassment. The fleet moved parallel to the army offshore, supplying them and preventing encirclement from the sea. The most heavily armored troops marched on the inland flank, absorbing the archery that Saladin's cavalry poured into them continuously. Richard rotated fresh units into this exposed position before the men on it broke, maintaining cohesion through hours of punishment that would have shattered a less disciplined force. His orders were absolute: no man charges without the signal. Men had arrows buried in their armor and continued marching. Men were pulled from their horses and continued marching on foot. The formation held. At Arsuf, Saladin finally forced a general engagement. The Hospitaller Knights at the rear of the column, their horses being killed around them, finally broke formation and charged without orders. Richard, seeing what was happening, immediately committed the entire army to support them. When formation breaks, the only response is to make the charge decisive before the enemy can exploit it. The Crusaders won. Saladin lost more men at Arsuf than in any battle since Hattin. Richard reached the outskirts of Jerusalem twice. Twice he withdrew. The decision haunted him for the rest of his life and has been debated by historians for 8 centuries. It was, by most military analyses, the correct decision. Jerusalem could probably be taken. But could it be held? Stripping the coast of its garrisons to besiege the city left the supply lines vulnerable. Philip had left. The great lords were quarreling over who would govern Jerusalem once it was taken. The kingdom's manpower was exhausted. Taking Jerusalem and immediately losing it, which the military situation made genuinely likely, would be worse, politically and spiritually, than not taking it at all. Standing on a hill outside the city with Jerusalem visible in the distance, Richard reportedly held his shield up to block his own view. He would not look at what he could not take. He negotiated instead. The Treaty of Jaffa, signed in September 1192, gave Saladin Jerusalem and gave the Crusaders the coastal strip from Tyre to Jaffa, with guaranteed access for unarmed Christian pilgrims to the holy sites. It was a reasonable settlement in the way that reasonable settlements are, imperfect, unsatisfying to both sides, durable precisely because either party had the strength to do better. Richard sailed for home. He was shipwrecked off the Adriatic coast, captured by Duke Leopold of Austria, who had a personal grudge from an incident at Acre, held for ransom, eventually released for a sum that took years to raise and impoverished England for a generation. He returned to England in 1194, spent 5 years fighting in France to recover the territories Philip had seized in his absence, and was killed by a crossbow bolt at the siege of a minor castle in 1199. He was 41 years old. Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands. Saladin himself had died in 1193, shortly after Richard left, giving away so much of his wealth that his treasury was nearly empty at his death, dying as he had lived, with a generosity that his enemies found easier to admire than to emulate. The Third Crusade was over. The Holy City was not recovered. And the question that had been deferred, the question of whether the crusading enterprise was working, whether the cost in blood and gold and moral compromise was producing anything worth the price, was becoming harder to avoid. The Crusades did not end with Richard's departure. They continued, a fourth, a fifth, a sixth, a seventh, and eighth, each one revealing something new about what the movement actually was beneath its stated purposes, each one demonstrating with increasing clarity the distance between the ideal of holy war and its reality. The Fourth Crusade, launched in 1202, never reached the Holy Land at all. It had been organized with genuine seriousness and aimed at Egypt, the strategic recognition that Jerusalem could not be permanently held until its most powerful neighbor was neutralized. The Crusaders needed ships, and the Venetians had ships. The price was a detour, first to recover the Adriatic city of Zara, a Christian city that had rebelled against Venetian commercial authority. Then, through a sequence of political complications involving a Byzantine prince named Alexios who promised money and military support if the Crusaders would help him reclaim the throne of Constantinople, to Constantinople itself. On April 13, 1204, the Crusader army that had been organized to recover Jerusalem from the Muslims instead stormed the walls of the greatest Christian city in the world. Constantinople had stood for 9 centuries. It had survived sieges by Avars, by Persians, by Arabs, by Bulgars, by Rus warriors from the north. It fell in a day to an army of Western Christians who were supposed to be fighting for God. What followed was 3 days of looting that stripped the wealthiest city in the medieval world of treasures accumulated since Constantine. The 4 great bronze horses that had stood above the hippodrome since antiquity were shipped to Venice, where they still crown the entrance to St. Mark's Basilica. Relics beyond counting were scattered to churches across Europe. The great library was ransacked, its contents burned, stolen, scattered in the street, lost to the world. Pope Innocent III, who had launched the Fourth Crusade with genuine enthusiasm, received the news and wrote letters of furious condemnation. He had not planned this. No one had planned exactly this. The Fourth Crusade was the crusading movement's unguarded self, all the impulses that the movement contained, the greed and the violence, and the contempt for those defined as other, running free of the religious purpose that normally provided some restraint. The Orthodox and Catholic churches had been formally separated since 1054. The sack of 1204 drove the wound so deep that it has not fully closed in 8 centuries. The Eastern Christian world would not forget what Western Crusaders had done to Constantinople. It does not forget still. The later Crusades had their moments of strange illumination. Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor, personally skeptical of religious enthusiasm in ways that made the papacy deeply uncomfortable, fluent in Arabic, genuinely knowledgeable about Islamic culture and philosophy, negotiated a treaty with the Sultan of Egypt in 1229 that returned Jerusalem to Christian control without a single battle being fought. The Pope excommunicated him for it. Not primarily because Frederick had taken too long to launch the crusade, though that was the official reason, but because he had demonstrated that the Muslim world could be reasoned with, could be made to agree to terms that served Christian interests through diplomacy rather than violence. If that was possible, it raised uncomfortable questions about what all the killing had been for. Jerusalem changed hands twice more, was finally lost to the Mamluk Sultan Baybars in the 1260s. Acre, the last major Crusader stronghold, fell on May 18, 1291, its defenders fighting street by street in a collapse so sudden and complete that the news reached Europe before anyone had fully absorbed what it meant. The Crusader states were gone. 2 centuries of effort. Hundreds of thousands dead. 3,000 miles of road traveled and retraveled. The wealth of Europe spent and spent again on expeditions that recovered Jerusalem briefly and lost it permanently, that established states that lasted 2 generations and then dissolved like morning frost. What did it leave behind? For the Islamic world, the Crusades were a significant episode, sometimes traumatic, ultimately manageable. The medieval Islamic world was more powerful than the Frankish settlers who had established their coastal kingdoms, and it outlasted them. The Mongol invasions of the 13th century were far more devastating to Islamic civilization than anything the Crusaders had accomplished. For the Byzantine Empire, the Crusades were a disaster from which it never recovered. The Fourth Crusade had broken something that could not be repaired. The restored Byzantine state that survived after 1261 was a shadow, smaller, weaker, mistrusted by both the Islamic world it faced to the east and the Catholic west that had betrayed it. When the Ottomans finally ended it in 1453, the end felt almost inevitable. For Europe, the effects were stranger and more lasting. The contact with the Islamic world, violent, sustained, commercially productive, transmitted knowledge that transformed European intellectual life. Arabic numerals moved west through Crusader ports. Algebra. Advances in medicine and astronomy and natural philosophy. Most significantly, the works of Aristotle, preserved in Arabic translation during the centuries when Europe had lost access to them, returned to the west through the channels that Crusader commerce had opened, and detonated an intellectual revolution in the European universities of the 12th and 13th centuries that produced the scholastic philosophy of Thomas Aquinas, and the new way of thinking about faith and reason that would eventually lead, through tortuous paths, to the scientific revolution. The commercial consequences were equally profound. The Italian city-states, Venice, Genoa, Pisa, had built the crusading enterprise's logistical foundations and extracted enormous commercial advantages in return. The wealth that flowed back to Italy from Eastern trade helped finance the Renaissance. The connection is indirect, contested, easy to oversimplify. But it is there. And the Crusades shaped the way Europe understood itself, and the world beyond its borders. The idea of Christendom, the belief that there was a civilization called Christian Europe with common values and common enemies and a common destiny, was sharpened and hardened by 2 centuries of intermittent warfare against a civilization that was, in many respects, more sophisticated than the one attacking it. The framework of holy war, the idea that killing could be sanctified, that certain enemies were so threatening to God's order that their destruction was required, did not originate with the Crusades. But the Crusades gave it institutional form and historical precedent that made it available for future application. It would be applied to European heretics, to Baltic pagans, to political enemies of the papacy, to the indigenous peoples of the Americas. Holy war, once legitimized, found many uses. In Jerusalem, which had been Roman and Christian and Muslim and Crusader and Muslim again and is. There are moments in history when the world changes so completely, so rapidly, so absolutely, that the people living through it cannot find language adequate to describe what is happening to them. The Black Death was one of those moments. Not a battle. Not an invasion. Not the slow, grinding collapse of an empire over decades and centuries. Something faster than any of those things and more democratic in its violence. A killer that did not distinguish between the powerful and the powerless, between the devout and the sinful, between the young and the old, between the warrior in his castle and the peasant in his field. Something that arrived without warning and killed without logic, that moved through populations with a speed and lethality that the medieval world had no framework to comprehend, no medicine to counter, no theology to fully explain. Between 1347 and 1353, the Black Death killed somewhere between 75 and 200 million people. The range of that estimate tells you something about the difficulty of counting the dead when the dying is happening faster than anyone can keep records. The best modern scholarship suggests that Europe alone lost between a third and a half of its entire population in the space of approximately 5 years. Some regions lost more. Some villages were emptied entirely, not a single survivor, the houses standing, the fields unworked, the livestock wandering without care, the church bells silent. In some parts of England, Italy, and France, the mortality rate approached 60 or 70%. To put those numbers in human terms requires an exercise of imagination that resists completion. Imagine every third person you have ever known dead. Imagine every third house on every street in every city in every country in Europe emptied. Imagine the fields unharvested, the trades untended, the schools closed, the courts silent, the monasteries emptied of the monks who had spent their lives copying manuscripts and praying the hours. Imagine the smell, a smell that contemporary chroniclers describe with a consistency that suggests they were all trying to name the same thing, a sweetish, rotting, overwhelming smell that settled over the cities and did not leave. Imagine all of that. And then understand that the people living through it had no idea when it would stop. Or if it would stop. Or whether what was happening was not the end of a plague but the end of the world. Because that was the question. The real question. Not when will it stop, but is this the end? The medieval Christian mind was steeped in apocalyptic expectation. The Book of Revelation described the end of days in language that the 14th century found grimly familiar. The pale horse, the pestilence, the dying of a third of humanity. When the plague came, the most rational response available to the theological framework of the age was not medical inquiry but eschatological calculation. Was this the third seal being opened? Was this the prelude to the Last Judgment? Should the survivors be preparing their souls rather than their medicine, praying rather than fleeing, confessing their sins rather than burning the bedding of the dead? These were not stupid questions. They were the questions that the best minds of the age, working within the intellectual tools available to them, could formulate. And the fact that they were the wrong questions, that the answer was not theology but microbiology, not sin but a bacterium called Yersinia pestis, does not make the people who ask them foolish. It makes them human. People facing the incomprehensible reach for the frameworks they have. The frameworks of the 14th century were almost entirely useless against what was coming. But before the dying, there was the traveling. The plague did not appear from nowhere. It had a geography, a route, a point of origin and a path of movement that can be traced, across the centuries, with reasonable precision. And that path begins not in Europe at all but in the vast, windswept grasslands of Central Asia, where the bacterium that causes bubonic plague lives permanently in the population of burrowing rodents, marmots, ground squirrels, rats, who have co-evolved with it over millennia into a relationship of mutual tolerance that does not extend to human beings. Something disturbed that equilibrium in the 1330s or 1340s. Climate, most likely, a series of droughts and famines that disrupted the normal patterns of rodent population and movement, pushing infected animals into contact with human settlements along the Silk Road trade routes. From the rodents, the plague moved to fleas. From the fleas to rats. And from the rats, inevitably, catastrophically, to people. It moved west along the trade routes. The same routes that had carried silk and spice and manuscript knowledge between China and the Mediterranean for centuries now carried something else, something invisible, hitching rides in the fur of rats in the holds of merchant ships, in the clothing and bedding of merchants and their servants, in the bodies of the fleas that lived on both. By 1346, it had reached the shores of the Black Sea. And there, at a Genoese trading post called Kaffa on the Crimean Peninsula, history records one of the earliest documented uses of biological warfare, though the people involved would not have recognized the term or the concept. A Mongol army besieging Kaffa began dying of the plague. The Mongol commander, in a decision that was either brilliant or simply desperate, ordered the bodies of his plague dead catapulted over the walls of the city. The Genoese traders inside Kaffa, already dealing with the disease spreading through their own population, loaded their ships and fled. They sailed for home. They carried the plague with them. The ships arrived at the Sicilian port of Messina in October 1347. The sailors aboard were already dying, their bodies covered with strange black swellings at the armpits and groin, seeping blood and pus, their skin darkened with subcutaneous hemorrhaging, their breath, contemporary accounts note with particular horror, carrying an unbearable stench. The port authorities of Messina, confronted with this sight, did something that was, by the medical understanding of the time, entirely rational. They ordered the ships out of the harbor. It was too late. Within days, people in Messina were dying with the same black swellings. Within weeks, the disease had spread to the surrounding countryside. By the end of the year, it was in the ports of Genoa and Venice and Marseille, the great commercial hubs of the medieval Mediterranean, cities whose networks of trade extended to every corner of Europe and whose ships visited every port from England to Egypt. The mechanism by which bubonic plague spreads was not understood by anyone in the 14th century and would not be scientifically established until 1894, when a French-Swiss bacteriologist named Alexander Yersin identified the bacterium. What the medieval world knew, what they could observe, was that people who came close to the sick became sick themselves, that the disease spread through cities with a speed that suggested person-to-person transmission, and that the black swellings were nearly always fatal. What they did not know was that the primary vector of transmission was not the sick person directly but the flea, Xenosiliciopes, that lived on the black rats that infested every port, every granary, every ship's hold, every cramped urban neighborhood in medieval Europe. The flea bit the infected rat. The rat died. The flea, suddenly without a host, jumped to the nearest warm body, usually a human. The flea bit the human. The bacterium Yersinia pestis entered the bloodstream. The lymph nodes, closest to the bite site, flooded with infected material and swelled into the characteristic buboes, the black swellings that gave the disease one of its names. The bacterium multiplied in the blood. The immune system, encountering something it had no evolved response to, was overwhelmed. Without treatment, and there was no treatment, death followed in 3 to 7 days in the majority of cases. There were 2 other forms of the disease. Septicemic plague, when the bacterium entered the bloodstream directly and spread to the organs without the bubo stage, was nearly 100% fatal, killing so quickly that some people went to bed healthy and were dead by morning. Pneumonic plague, when the infection reached the lungs and could be transmitted person to person through respiratory droplets, was also nearly always fatal and spread with even greater speed in crowded conditions. The medieval world, confronting this, reached for every explanation it had. The medical faculty of the University of Paris, commissioned by the French king to explain the catastrophe, produced a report in 1348 that identified the cause as a conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in the sign of Aquarius in 1345, a celestial alignment that had, they explained, produced the corruption of the surrounding air that was the proximate cause of the pestilence. This was not ignorance masquerading as science. It was the best science of the age, the application of Galenic medical theory and Aristotelian natural philosophy to an observable phenomenon. The theory of miasma, that disease was caused by corrupt or poisoned air, was the dominant medical paradigm of the medieval world and had, for many diseases, provided a reasonable approximation of practical public health measures. Bad air, after all, was often associated with bad water and bad sanitation, which actually did cause disease. For the Black Death, miasma theory was wrong in its mechanism but not entirely wrong in its recommendations. Fleeing the cities, putting distance between yourself and the infected population, actually did reduce your chances of exposure, even if the reasons were not what the physicians understood. Burning the possessions of the dead actually did reduce the flea population in a household, even if the understanding of why was entirely absent. But it was also catastrophically inadequate to the scale of what was happening. The smell was real. The chroniclers who describe it are describing the smell of necrotic tissue, the breakdown of the body's cells under massive bacterial infection, the same process that produces the characteristic odor of gangrene. People carried bunches of flowers and herbs to hold before their faces. They burned aromatic woods. They opened windows and closed windows. They prayed. They flagellated themselves in public processions, whipping their own backs bloody in the belief that if God was punishing humanity for its sins, perhaps sufficient self-inflicted suffering would satisfy the divine demand and stop the killing. The flagellant movement swept through Germany and the Low Countries and France in 1348 and 1349 with a fervor that alarmed the Church, not because the penitential impulse was wrong, but because the flagellants were increasingly claiming that their own self-mortification was sufficient for salvation without the mediation of priests and sacraments, which was heresy, and because the movement was producing social chaos, and because some of its more extreme representatives were preaching that the plague was God's punishment specifically for the corruption of the clergy, which was dangerous. Pope Clement VI, who had retreated to Avignon and spent the plague years sitting between two large fires, a reasonable precaution given that heat does kill fleas, though Clement did not know this, condemned the flagellant movement in October 1349 and threatened its members with excommunication. The movement gradually subsided. The plague did not. It moved through Europe along the roads and the rivers and the sea lanes that human beings had built for trade and communication and the movement of armies. Everything that connected the medieval world, every road that Charlemagne's engineers had maintained, every sea route that Venetian merchants had mapped, every river valley that served as a natural highway through the interior of the continent, became a corridor for the plague. The same network that had made medieval Europe more integrated, more commercial, more connected than it had been since the fall of Rome, now made it impossible to contain the disaster. From the Italian ports it moved north and west with terrible speed. Florence, one of the greatest cities of the medieval world, the center of Italian banking and commerce and the early stirrings of the Renaissance that would eventually transform European culture, lost perhaps 60% of its population in the plague of 1348. The Florentine writer Giovanni Boccaccio, who survived the plague and wrote about it in the introduction to his Decameron, a collection of stories imagined as being told by a group of young Florentines who had fled the city to a country villa to wait out the pestilence, left behind a description that remains, nearly 700 years later, one of the most powerful pieces of eyewitness writing in any language. He describes the progression of the disease. He describes the abandonment of the normal social bonds, fathers abandoning children, wives fleeing husbands, neighbors refusing to help neighbors, the entire fabric of civic and familial obligation dissolved by fear. He describes bodies in the street, bodies in houses, bodies discovered days after death by the smell. He describes the gravediggers, men who, seeing an opportunity, charged extraordinary prices for their services and grew rich while everyone around them died. He describes the black humor that developed among the survivors, the parties, the drinking, the determined pursuit of pleasure in a city where pleasure seemed the only reasonable response to universal death. And he describes the pits. When the churchyards filled, when the carefully maintained individual graves that Christian burial tradition demanded were simply not possible to provide for the dying faster than the living could dig, the cities dug pits. Large pits, outside the city walls, into which bodies were laid in layers, sprinkled with earth, more bodies on top, more earth, building up in strata until the pit was full and a new one had to be dug. There were not enough priests to say Mass over all the dead. There were not enough clergy left alive in some places to perform the rites at all. People died unshriven, without the last rites that Catholic theology held were necessary for the soul's safe passage through purgatory, and those who survived them carried that knowledge as an additional weight on top of everything else. In England, the plague arrived in June 1348, at the port of Weymouth on the southern coast. By the time it reached London in the autumn, it was killing hundreds of people a day in a city of perhaps 80,000. By the time it had moved north through England and into Scotland, it had killed, best estimates suggest, between 40 and 50% of the English population. The Archbishop of Canterbury died. His successor died. His successor's successor died. 3 archbishops of Canterbury in the space of a year, in a church that normally expected its senior clergy to hold office for decades. The records that survive from English parishes and manors during the plague years have the character of documents written in a state of shock, the handwriting deteriorating, the usual careful accounting giving way to brief, desperate entries, names crossed out, whole pages left blank where the scribe who was supposed to fill them had died before he could do so. In some villages in southern France and Italy, the mortality was so complete that the village simply ceased to exist. The physical remains, the walls of houses, the church, the mill, survived for centuries, slowly consumed by vegetation, the sites visible today as grass-covered humps and otherwise empty landscapes. Archaeologists call them deserted medieval villages. The term is accurate, and somehow inadequate to what it describes. The plague reached Norway in 1349, traveling on a ship from England whose crew had died at sea. The ship drifted into Bergen harbor with its cargo and its dead, and the plague walked off the ship and into Norway and killed perhaps half the Norwegian population. It reached Sweden and Denmark. It reached Poland and Russia, though with somewhat lower mortality in the more sparsely populated East. It reached North Africa and the Middle East, where it killed with equal ferocity. Cairo, the largest city in the medieval world with perhaps 500,000 inhabitants, lost perhaps 40% of its population. There was nowhere to run that was safe. The few places that seemed to escape, Milan, which implemented early and ruthless quarantine measures, walling up houses where plague appeared with the inhabitants inside, living and dead together, did so through methods that exchanged individuals suffering for collective survival, a calculation that the people inside the walled-up houses might not have endorsed. And through all of it, the dying continued. The first great wave of the plague subsided in Europe around 1353. But it did not go away. It came back, in 1361, in 1369, in 1374, in 1390, in 1400. Wave after wave, each one less lethal than the first but still deadly, still capable of killing a third of the children born after the first wave in a city that had not yet recovered from the original catastrophe. The plague would remain endemic in Europe until the 18th century, reappearing roughly every generation, shaping the psychology and the demography and the economy and the theology of the continent in ways that took centuries to fully work through. The Black Death was not an event. It was a condition. What does it do to a civilization, to lose a third of itself in 5 years? The question has no single answer. It has dozens of answers, operating at different scales and in different domains, working themselves out over decades and centuries in ways that were often invisible to the people living through them. The most immediate effect was economic, and it was, for the survivors, in a terrible and complicated way, beneficial. Labor was suddenly scarce. Dramatically, catastrophically scarce. The peasant population that had worked the land of medieval Europe, that enormous mass of bound labor, tied to manorial estates by the legal obligations of serfdom, providing the physical work that made everything else possible, had been reduced by a third or more. And labor, like any commodity, becomes more valuable when it becomes rare. The peasants who survived knew this. They understood, in a way that their parents and grandparents had not been able to understand, that their labor had value, real, negotiable, market value, and that lords who wanted their fields worked were going to have to compete for workers rather than simply demanding their feudal due. Peasants began moving. They left manors where the conditions were bad and went to manors where the lord was offering better terms. They moved to towns, where wages were rising rapidly because the craftsmen and merchants and servants that the urban economy needed had also died. They negotiated. They demanded. The lords tried to stop them. In England, the Statute of Labourers of 1351 attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and prevent workers from moving between employers. Similar legislation appeared across Europe, desperate attempts by the landholding class to maintain the economic relationships that the plague had destroyed. The attempts failed, or rather they succeeded only partially and temporarily, because the fundamental economic reality was unchanged. There were fewer workers. Workers had leverage. No law could change that arithmetic. The frustration that accumulated through the decades following the Black Death, the anger of peasants who understood their value but faced constant legal obstruction to realizing it, the grievances of a class that had survived catastrophe and expected something different from the world that remained, erupted in a series of popular revolts that are among the most significant political events of the late 14th century. The Jacquerie in France in 1358. The English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, in which a rebel army marched on London, opened the Tower, executed the Archbishop of Canterbury, and briefly held the city before being dispersed through a combination of royal promise and aristocratic violence that included the summary execution of the rebel leader Wat Tyler at a parley that had been called under a promise of safe conduct. The revolts were suppressed. The rebels were executed. The immediate demands were not met. But the long-term trajectory was irreversible. Serfdom in Western Europe was dying. Not quickly, not cleanly, but dying, because the economic conditions that had sustained it had been destroyed by the plague. Over the following century, the legal bonds that tied peasants to the land were gradually relaxed in England, in France, in the Low Countries and Germany. Not from any sudden access of moral enlightenment among the landowning class. The process was too grudging and too slow and too marked by attempts at reversal for that explanation to be convincing. But because the system could not be maintained against the simple arithmetic of labor scarcity. The Black Death did not end feudalism. But it broke the conditions that made feudalism possible to sustain. The economic disruption cut in other directions too. The great banking houses of Italy, the Bardi and the Peruzzi, who had been the financial backbone of European commerce in the first half of the 14th century, had already been weakened by the English crown's default on its war debts. The plague finished many of them. New banking families rose in their place. The economic geography of Europe shifted as some cities recovered faster than others, as some trade routes were disrupted permanently, and others found new importance. The Church faced a crisis of authority and credibility from which it would not fully recover. The reasons were multiple and mutually reinforcing. The clergy had died alongside everyone else, in some places at higher rates, because their pastoral duties brought them into contact with the sick and dying that flight would have spared them. The Church's response to the plague had been, by any measure, inadequate, not through any particular failure of nerve or compassion, but because the theological and medical tools available to it were genuinely inadequate to the crisis. Prayer did not stop the plague. Confession did not stop the plague. The sacraments, faithfully administered, did not stop the plague. And the plague did not seem to distinguish between the faithful and the faithless, between those who had received the last rites and those who had died in the gutter without a priest anywhere near them. This created a theological problem of the first order. The medieval church's authority rested in part on its claim to be the necessary intermediary between humanity and God, the institution that administered the sacraments through which salvation was obtained, whose priesthood had been given the unique power to bind and loose sins, whose intercessory prayer was more efficacious than the prayer of ordinary people. The plague raised the question, quietly at first, and then more loudly as the 14th century progressed, of whether that claim was actually true. If God had allowed this, if God had permitted the death of half of Christendom, including enormous numbers of perfectly devout Christians who had received all the sacraments and done everything the Church required, what did that say about either God or the Church or both? The answers that the Church's theologians produced were not satisfying to everyone. The questions that had been raised did not go away. The culture that emerged from the Black Death was marked by death in ways that had no precedent in European history. The danse macabre, the dance of death, became one of the defining artistic themes of the late 14th and 15th centuries. The image was always the same in its essential structure: figures of death, usually depicted as skeletons, leading a procession of people from every level of society: pope and emperor, king and bishop, merchant and peasant, young and old, male and female, in a dance toward the grave. The message was explicit and egalitarian in the way that the plague itself had been egalitarian. Death comes for everyone. No rank, no wealth, no virtue protects you. The pope dances with the peasant. The emperor takes the hand of the beggar. In the end, the same darkness receives them all. This was not nihilism, exactly. Or rather, it was nihilism that had been processed through the particular lens of Christian theology, and come out the other side as something more complex. A meditation on the vanity of earthly distinctions, a reminder of the only thing that truly mattered, which was the state of the soul at the moment of death. But it was a darker, more anxious Christianity than the confident faith that had built the great cathedrals of the 12th century. The God of the danse macabre was not the benevolent father of Franciscan spirituality, or the rational first principle of Thomistic philosophy. He was a God who permitted catastrophe. A God whose ways were genuinely inscrutable. A God before whom the only appropriate response was not confidence but trembling. The obsession with death expressed itself in painting and sculpture in ways that would have seemed grotesque to an earlier generation. The transite tomb, a grave monument that depicted the deceased not in idealized, youthful beauty as earlier medieval tomb sculpture had done, but as a decomposing corpse, complete with worms and exposed bones and the realistic detail of physical dissolution, became fashionable among the wealthy who could afford elaborate memorials. They commissioned images of what they would become. They wanted to see it. They wanted to be reminded. This was memento mori taken to its literal extreme, not just remember that you will die, but here is what that will look like, rendered in stone, in the church where you will be buried, for everyone who comes after you to see. The art of the late 14th and 15th centuries, the work of painters like Hans Baldung-Gren, of the anonymous masters who created the great woodcut sequences of the Dance of Death that spread across northern Europe with the printing press, has a quality that distinguishes it immediately from the art of the high medieval period. A rawness, a physicality, an attention to suffering and decay that earlier religious art had sublimated into symbolic representation. The body matters in this art in a way it had not quite mattered before: its pain, its fragility, its ultimate reduction to bone and dust. But the post-plague culture was not only about death. There was also, and this is perhaps the most surprising thing, a kind of vitality. A grasping at life that produced, in the decades and centuries after the Black Death, some of the most extraordinary cultural flowering in European history. The connection between the Black Death and the Renaissance is one of the more contested relationships in historical scholarship. The simplistic version, plague killed feudalism, killed the medieval church, released human creativity, produced the Renaissance. Is too clean, too teleological, too much like the kind of narrative that history only produces when you squint hard enough to make the connections look inevitable. The Renaissance had many causes, only some of which can be traced to the Black Death. But the connection is not imaginary. Florence, which had lost 60% of its population in 1348, produced, within 2 generations of the plague, Brunelleschi and Donatello and Ghiberti, the founding figures of Renaissance art and architecture. The survivors and their children, living in a city of reduced population but concentrated wealth, the estates of the dead had been inherited by those who remained, had both the resources and the psychological motivation to invest in beauty, in permanence, in things that would last beyond the next epidemic. Giovanni Boccaccio, who had written about the plague with such unflinching honesty, also wrote the Decameron, 100 stories told by young survivors escaping the city, stories that are funny and bawdy and human and secular in ways that earlier medieval literature rarely allowed itself to be. The human being, in the Decameron, is not primarily a soul in transit to eternity. He is a person in the present moment, with desires and appetites and a very specific relationship to the material world. The secular individual, the person who exists in time rather than primarily in relation to God, is beginning to emerge in these pages. Francesco Petrarch, Boccaccio's older contemporary, who survived the plague that killed his beloved Laura, developed in response a form of introspective self-examination that would become the foundation of Renaissance humanism, the movement that placed the human being, rather than God, at the center of intellectual inquiry. Petrarch did not abandon Christianity, but he was interested, with an intensity that his medieval predecessors had not permitted themselves, in what it meant to be a human being in this particular life. The Black Death had, in the most brutal possible way, focused attention on the present, on this life, on the world that could be experienced, touched, tasted, lost, on the body that was so terrifyingly fragile, on the individual who had survived when so many had not, and who faced the question of what to do with a survival that felt, in some ways, arbitrary. These are not comfortable questions, but they are creative ones. And the culture that emerged from the plague, darker, more anxious, more individual, more interested in the human body in the present world and the fragility of all human arrangements, was also, in its way, more alive, more urgently engaged with the problem of what it means to be human. The plague had stripped everything else away. What remained was the question. The social world that the Black Death left behind was different in ways that took generations to fully understand. The shortage of labor had changed the relationship between classes in ways that no law could fully reverse. But it had done something else too, something subtler and in the long run perhaps more consequential. It had changed the way that ordinary people thought about themselves and their place in the world. The peasant who had survived the Black Death, who had watched lords and bishops and kings die alongside the lowest serf, who had seen the church's prayers prove no more efficacious than the medicine man's herbs, who had found himself suddenly in a labor market where his work had value and his choices mattered. This person was not the same as his grandfather. Not quite. Something had shifted in the experience of what it meant to be at the bottom of the social hierarchy. A new, fragile, barely articulate sense that the arrangements of the feudal world were not eternal, not divinely ordained, not simply the natural order of things but rather agreements that could, in principle, be renegotiated. This was not yet the Reformation. It was not yet democracy. It was something earlier and more tentative, a change in the psychological substrate on which those later developments would eventually grow. The religious landscape had also changed in ways that would take decades to become fully visible. The institutional church had survived the Black Death. Its physical infrastructure, the cathedrals, the monasteries, the parishes, the vast administrative apparatus that connected every village in Christendom to Rome, had come through damage but functional. What had been damaged more deeply was something less visible, the sense that the Church's claim to spiritual authority rested on a secure foundation. New forms of spirituality began to develop in the decades after the plague, forms that were not heretical in their theology but that placed less emphasis on the institutional mediation of the Church and more on the direct personal relationship between the individual and God. The Devotio Moderna movement in the Low Countries, which produced, among other things, The Imitation of Christ, one of the most widely read books of the late medieval period, emphasized personal piety, individual scripture reading, the inner life as the primary arena of spiritual experience. It did not reject the Church, but it quietly dissented it. John Wycliffe in England and Jan Hus in Bohemia went further, questioning not just the Church's practice but its theology, arguing for the primacy of Scripture over ecclesiastical tradition, for the right of ordinary people to read the Bible in their own language, for a Christianity that did not require the elaborate priestly machinery of the medieval Church for its functioning. Both were condemned as heretics. Huss was burned at the Council of Constance in 1415, a martyrdom that ignited a rebellion in Bohemia that lasted decades. Wycliffe's followers, the Lollards, were persecuted in England but not eradicated. The seeds were being planted. The Reformation, which would split Western Christianity in the 16th century, had roots that reached deep into the post-plague soil of the 14th. The plague had also, in ways that are difficult to trace precisely but impossible to ignore, changed Europe's relationship with its Jewish communities. The search for someone to blame, for an explanation of the catastrophe that was more morally satisfying than random bacterial infection, had almost immediately produced accusations against Jewish people. The accusation that Jews had poisoned the wells, deliberately introduced the plague into Christian communities through contamination of water sources, spread through the Rhineland and France and Switzerland and Spain with the speed that suggests it met a psychological need rather than any rational assessment of evidence. Jewish communities lived separately from the Christian majority, following dietary laws and religious practices that kept them physically apart. Their mortality from the plague was, in some places, measurably lower, not because they were poisoning anyone but because their practices of ritual handwashing and their dietary restrictions that kept them away from pork, and therefore from the pigs that lived in close contact with the rats that carried the fleas that spread the plague, provided some incidental protection. This difference in mortality rate was not evidence of poisoning, but to a community convulsed by terror and grief and the need for explanation, it looked like evidence of something. The massacres that followed in 1348 and 1349, in Basel, Strasbourg, Frankfurt, Mainz, Cologne, and hundreds of other cities and towns, killed tens of thousands of Jewish people and destroyed communities that had existed for centuries. Pope Clement VI condemned the massacres from Avignon, correctly pointing out that Jews were dying from the plague in places where no well poisoning could have occurred, that the accusation was absurd and the killing sinful. The massacres continued. The Jewish communities of the Rhineland, those ancient, cultured, Hebrew scholarly communities that had produced great rabbinical thinkers and that had survived 1,000 years of precarious existence in Christian Europe, were devastated. Many of those who survived moved east, to Poland and Lithuania and the other territories of Eastern Europe where local rulers, recognizing the economic value of Jewish merchants and craftsmen, offered relative protection. The center of gravity of European Jewish life shifted eastward in the aftermath of the Black Death, and did not fully shift back for centuries. The world the plague left behind was not the world that had existed before it. This seems too obvious to state, and yet it is easy to underestimate how thoroughly the disaster had rearranged everything: the population, the economy, the class structure, the religious landscape, the artistic culture, the psychology of an entire civilization. It was a smaller world. Quieter. Marked by absence in ways that are hard to quantify but that contemporaries felt constantly. The empty house at the end of the street, the half-filled church, The manor that had 15 tenants where once it had 40. The family that had lost 4 of its 7 children and was still, a generation later, not sure how to think about what had happened. And yet it kept going. This is perhaps the most remarkable thing about the Black Death, not the dying, terrible as it was, but the living that continued afterward. The persistence of ordinary human life in the face of catastrophe that should, by any rational measure, have been unsurvivable. People rebuilt. They replanted the fields. They reopened the shops. They had children, more children, in the generation after the plague than they had before, as if the biological imperative toward continuation was running faster in response to what had been lost. The population of Europe would not return to its pre-plague levels until the 16th century. 200 years of recovery. But the direction was always upward, always toward more, always toward the complicated and imperfect continuation of human life in the world. They also created. The visual arts of the late 14th and 15th centuries are among the most extraordinary in human history, not despite the shadow of the plague, but in some complicated relationship with it. The Flemish painters, Jan van Eyck, Rogier van der Weyden, Hans Memling, developed in the decades after the Black Death a technique of oil painting that allowed a precision of observation, a rendering of the physical world in all its textures and light and shadow, that had never been achieved before. Their altarpieces and portraits show faces of startling individuality, objects rendered with a microscopic attention to their physical reality, an insistence on the specific and the concrete that is the opposite of the abstract symbolic art of the high medieval period. They were painting the world. Not the idea of the world, not the symbolic representation of theological truth, but the actual world, the light on a glass of water, the weave of a fabric, the particular way a human face holds its history. As if, having been reminded so brutally that the world could be lost, they needed to hold it in paint with every precision their craft could provide. In Italy, the Florentine painters and sculptors of the early 15th century were doing something similar, and going further, into the recovery of ancient models, the study of the human body, the mathematical investigation of perspective, all the elements that would coalesce into the Renaissance. Masaccio and Donatello and Brunelleschi, working in a Florence still carrying the memory of the plague, invented a new way of representing the world that would become the foundation of 5 centuries of Western art. The great English poet Geoffrey Chaucer, writing in the decades after the Black Death, produced the Canterbury Tales, a collection of stories told by pilgrims traveling to the shrine of Thomas Becket, representing every level of English society, full of humor and bawdiness and moral complexity and a delight in the variety of human experience that has not aged in 700 years. Chaucer's world is post-plague in ways that are not always obvious. The social fluidity, the mixing of classes on the road, the secular delight in the material world, but that become visible when you know what has come before. The plague had done something to time. Before the Black Death, the medieval world had a particular relationship with time, the sense that the structure of society was fixed, divinely ordained, essentially permanent. The great chain of being, with God at the top and the lowliest serf at the bottom, had always been thus, and would always be thus. History was essentially cyclical, the same patterns of sin and punishment, fall and recovery, with the second coming always theoretically imminent but practically indefinitely deferred. The Black Death broke this sense of permanence. Not immediately, not completely, but in the way that catastrophe always breaks the assumption that things will continue as they have been. The medieval mind emerged from the plague with a sharper, more anxious awareness of contingency, of the possibility that things could change, that they had changed, that the world before 1347 was genuinely gone, and what came after would be genuinely different. This awareness was uncomfortable. It was also productive. The anxiety about contingency is one of the engines of historical change, the fuel that powers the search for something more stable, more rational, more humanly controlled. The Renaissance's investment in human reason and human capacity, the Reformation's insistence on the direct individual relationship with God, the gradual development of empirical science as a way of understanding a world that had proved so resistant to theological explanation, all of these, in their different ways, can be understood as responses to the experience of radical contingency that the Black Death had imposed. The medieval world had been organized around certainty. The certainty of the Church's authority. The certainty of the social hierarchy. The certainty of the cosmic order, with God governing the sublunary world through the medium of the Church and the Christian king. The Black Death had demonstrated, with a thoroughness that no argument could have achieved, that the certainty was an illusion. The world was not governed by rules that human beings could fully understand or reliably predict. It was more chaotic, more dangerous, more indifferent to human arrangements than the medieval worldview had allowed. To live with that knowledge, to rebuild civilization on a foundation that now included the awareness of its own fragility, required something new. Something that the medieval world had not quite possessed, and that the world after the Black Death was slowly, painfully, not yet consciously beginning to develop. A different relationship with uncertainty. A willingness to live in a world that could not be fully understood or controlled, and to do so not in the posture of religious resignation but in the posture of active inquiry, asking questions, testing answers, building knowledge that was provisional rather than eternal, human rather than divine. This was not the Renaissance. Not yet. Not quite. But it was the ground from which the Renaissance would grow. And somewhere in the emptied fields and the mass graves and the silent churches of 14th century Europe, in the traumatized survivors who kept living despite everything, in the artists who kept painting and the writers who kept writing and the farmers who kept planting, the future was already taking its first tentative shape. The Black Death had killed a third of the world that Charlemagne had built, that the knights had defended, that the Crusaders had fought for. What grew in the space the dying had left behind was something that none of them had imagined and all of them had, in their different ways, made possible. The medieval world was not over. But it was changing. And the change, once begun, would not stop. History tends to remember the dramatic moments. The battles. The plagues. The coronations and the executions and the moments when one world ends and another begins. History remembers Alaric at the gates of Rome and Charlemagne kneeling in St. Peter's and the crowd at Clermont shouting Deus, Vult, and the ships arriving at Messina with their dying crews. These are the moments that make the record, that produce the chronicles and the letters and the administrative documents that historians work from, the moments that seemed, even to the people living through them, like the hinge points of the world. But most of medieval life was not like that. Most of medieval life was ordinary. Unremarkably, stubbornly, magnificently ordinary. It was the rhythm of the agricultural year. Plowing and planting and tending and harvesting, the same tasks in the same fields in the same seasons that your father had worked and his father before him, stretching back further than living memory could reach. It was the sound of the church bell marking the canonical hours, matins and lauds and prime and terce and sext and none and vespers and compline, the liturgical clock that structured every day from before dawn to after dark. It was the smell of wood smoke and animal dung and baking bread and the particular damp cold of a stone building in winter that no fire could quite dispel. It was birth and death and everything between, the marriage negotiated by families, the children raised in circumstances that modern eyes find harsh beyond imagining and that medieval people understood as simply the conditions of existence, the illness survived and the illness that was not survived, the slow accumulation of a life in one place among the same people under the same sky. To understand the medieval world, really understand it, not just its dramatic moments but its texture, its daily reality, the way it felt from the inside, you have to understand two things above all others. The castle. And the system the castle made possible. These two things, the physical structure and the social arrangement it embodied, were not separate. The castle was feudalism made stone. It was the system's most visible expression, the point at which the abstract arrangements of lord and vassal and serf and priest became concrete, became a thing you could see on the horizon, could walk toward, could stand beneath and feel the particular quality of powerlessness that its designers intended you to feel. And feudalism was the castle's reason for existence. The web of obligation and protection and exploitation that the castle anchored, that it defended, that it administered, that it projected across the landscape in the form of the Lord's jurisdiction over the land and the people the land contained. To understand one, you have to understand both. So let us begin where the medieval peasant began every morning of his life. He woke before dawn. Not by choice, or rather, by a choice that was not really a choice, because the animals needed feeding before the day's work could begin, and the day's work needed to be done before the light failed, and the light failed early in the northern European winters that defined so much of the medieval agricultural calendar. He slept in a building that housed his family, and quite possibly his animals in the same space, not from ignorance but from practical wisdom, because the body heat of cattle and pigs was a significant contribution to the warmth of a structure with no glass in its windows and a fire that could not be left burning through the night. He was not, in most of Western Europe after the 11th century, a slave. He was something more complicated, a serf, or a villain, or a free peasant, depending on the precise legal status that varied enormously by region and period and the specific terms of his family's relationship with the lord of the manor. The distinction between these categories was significant to the people involved and has occupied historians for generations. But from a practical standpoint, what all these statuses shared was more important than what divided them. The land was not his. The mill was not his. The oven where he baked his bread was not his. The forest where he might have supplemented his diet with game was not his. Poaching was a serious crime, and the penalties ranged from fines to mutilation to death, depending on what was taken and from whose land. The road that connected his village to the next was not his, though he was responsible for maintaining it. Even his labor was not entirely his. He owed the Lord a certain number of days of work each week on the Lord's domain, the fields that the Lord kept for his own use and that the peasants of the manor were obligated to work without payment. What was his was the strip of land his family farmed, not a contiguous field but a series of narrow strips scattered across the open fields that surrounded the village, interspersed with the strips of his neighbors in the complex pattern of the open field system that had organized English and French and German agriculture for centuries. His house, his tools, his animals, if he was prosperous enough to own them, his family, and his connection, tenuous, exploitative, but real, to the Lord in the castle on the hill. The castle had not always looked the way we imagine it. The image that the word conjures, the massive stone keep, the concentric walls, the towers at the corners, the drawbridge over the moat, the great hall within, is the product of centuries of development, of accumulated military experience and architectural innovation and the particular arms race between offensive and defensive technology that drove castle design through the high medieval period. The first castles of the feudal era were nothing like this. They were mounds of earth with wooden towers on top. The Motte and Bailey Castle, that basic formula that spread across northern Europe in the 9th and 10th centuries as the feudal system was taking shape, was a structure of deliberate simplicity. The motte was a raised mound of compacted earth, as high as the available labor and time allowed, typically between 10 and 30 feet. On top of the motte stood a wooden tower, the keep, the Lord's residence and last refuge, accessible from below only by a bridge or ladder that could be pulled up quickly if the outer defenses fell. Around the base of the motte was the bailey, an enclosed courtyard, surrounded by a wooden palisade and perhaps a ditch, where the Lord's household lived and worked, where the stables and the smithy and the storage buildings were located. It could be built in days. A lord establishing himself in new territory could throw up a motte and bailey in a week with sufficient labor, immediately acquiring the defensive advantage and the visual dominance that the raised position provided. The Normans, those extraordinary military entrepreneurs who transformed England in 1066, carved out kingdoms in southern Italy and Sicily, established themselves in the Holy Land, built motte and bailey castles across their conquered territories with a speed that was itself a form of military power. By the time a conquered population had organized effective resistance, the castle was already there, already occupied, already the physical fact around which the new social order was being organized. The weakness of the motte and bailey was obvious and accepted. Wood burns. Wood rots. A wooden tower on an earthen mound was a temporary statement of power, not a permanent one. And as the feudal system consolidated, as the lords who had established themselves through conquests began to think about permanence rather than immediate dominance, the motte and bailey was replaced, or rather, overlaid, by something more durable. Stone. The transition from wood to stone happened gradually through the 11th and 12th centuries, and it changed everything about what a castle was and what it meant. A stone keep could not be burned, could not rot, could, if properly maintained, last indefinitely, and the oldest stone keeps in England and France and Germany are still standing today, their walls 8 to 12 feet thick at the base, their floors still solid after 9 centuries, their narrow staircases still turning in the direction that gave right-handed defenders an advantage against right-handed attackers coming up from below. Every detail of their construction reflects a specific military calculation. Every window was an arrow slit before it was a source of light. Every doorway was designed to force an attacker to slow and expose himself. Every floor was a potential last line of defense. The stone keep was followed by the curtain wall, the great outer defensive perimeter of cut stone that replaced the wooden palisade, with mural towers at intervals allowing archers to cover every approach to the walls from multiple angles simultaneously, eliminating the dead ground that a flat wall would leave for attackers to shelter in. Then the gatehouse, that extraordinarily elaborate complex of portcullis and drawbridge and murder holes and flanking towers that turned the castle's most vulnerable point, its entrance, into its most heavily defended feature. Then the inner bailey and the outer bailey, the concentric rings of defense that made the great castles of the 13th century effectively a series of fortresses nested within each other, so that capturing the outer wall merely deposited an attacker inside another fortified space rather than at the end of his difficulties. Water completed the system. The moat, where the terrain allowed it, was not merely a psychological barrier. It was a physical obstacle that prevented the wheeled siege engines of the period from being brought up to the walls, that made undermining the foundations extremely difficult, that added another layer to the concentric defenses. A castle with a proper water-filled moat, a drawbridge that could be raised in minutes, walls of sufficient thickness to resist trebuchet fire, and a garrison supplied for a long siege was, by the military technology of the high medieval period, essentially impregnable to direct assault. Which is why direct assault was rarely attempted. Siege warfare was the dominant form of medieval military operation, and the dominant form of siege warfare was not assault but starvation. Surround the castle. Cut its supply lines. Wait. The garrison had water from a well within the walls. It had stored food. How much depended on the lord's prudence and the size of his storerooms. It might have a small herd of animals in the inner bailey that could be slaughtered progressively as the siege extended. But eventually, if the besieging army was patient enough and sufficiently supplied itself, the food ran out. The drama of medieval warfare, the scaling ladders and the battering rams and the siege towers and the catapults, these existed, and they were used. But they were the expensive, high-risk options. The patient option was hunger. And hunger, in the end, almost always won. Inside the castle, life was organized around a hierarchy as precise and as carefully maintained as anything in the feudal world beyond its walls. At the top was the lord. In theory, in the ideology of the period, the lord was the castle, its reason for existence, the source of its authority, the person whose name it bore and whose interests it served. The reality was more complex. Great lords spent much of their time away from any single castle, traveling between their various holdings, attending the king's court, conducting military campaigns, managing the political relationships that their position required. The actual day-to-day administration of a castle and its dependent lands was handled by a staff of officials whose positions had specific titles and specific functions that were carefully distinguished from each other. The constable was responsible for the military security of the castle, the garrison, the weapons, the maintenance of the defensive works. The steward managed the lord's household and estates, overseeing the agricultural production that was the economic foundation of everything. The chamberlain attended to the lord's personal needs, his clothing, his chamber, his personal possessions. The marshal managed the horses and the military equipment that a lord's household required. And below these senior officials were dozens of lesser servants, cooks, grooms, laundresses, pages, clerks, the human machinery that kept the castle functioning. The Great Hall was the castle's social center, the space where the lord's household ate together, where justice was administered, where important guests were received, where the community of the castle demonstrated its own existence to itself through the rituals of common life. It was large, deliberately large, because size communicated power, and the ability to feed large numbers of people was itself a form of wealth display. The lord and his senior household sat at the high table, on a raised dais at one end of the hall, looking down the length of the room at the lesser tables arranged below them. The hierarchy of seating was exact and meaningful. Your position at the table communicated your position in the social order with a precision that everyone in the room could read. Food was political. The quantities served at the lord's table, the variety of dishes, the quality of the wine, the presence of expensive spices like pepper and cinnamon and cloves that had traveled from the other side of the world to season the food of the wealthy. All of this communicated status and wealth to the guests who shared the meal. Medieval feasting was not simply eating. It was a performance of social reality. The lord who could feed his guests well was demonstrating that his lands were productive, his management was competent, his position was secure. The lord who served poor food was advertising weakness. The castle's chapel was its spiritual center, a small stone church within the walls, served by a chaplain who was usually also the lord's secretary, and sometimes his most trusted advisor. The rhythm of prayer that structured every day, those canonical hours that the church bells marked across the entire medieval landscape, were observed in the castle chapel with particular formality, because the lord's household was, in its way, a religious community as much as a military one. The chaplain heard confession, performed the Mass, administered the sacraments to the household, educated the children of the castle in Latin and in the basics of literacy that the administrative needs of a medieval estate required. Between the castle and the village that depended on it, the economic relationship was conducted through a network of obligations so complex and so deeply embedded in local custom that no two manors operated on exactly the same terms. The manor court was the institutional heart of this relationship. Meeting at regular intervals, typically several times a year, the manor court heard disputes between tenants, regulated the agricultural calendar, enforced the obligations that tenants owed to the lord, and administered the fines and penalties that were a significant source of the lord's income. The court was presided over by the lord or his steward, but its juries were drawn from the peasant community itself, free tenants who were both subject to the court's authority and participants in its administration. This is one of the more interesting and underappreciated aspects of medieval rural governance. The manor court was not simply a mechanism of lordly oppression, though it was certainly available for that purpose. It was also a community institution that gave peasants a recognized role in the regulation of their own affairs. The customs of the manor, the specific terms on which tenants held their land, the precise obligations they owed, the rights they had to common pasture and woodland and water, were recorded in the court rolls and enforced by the court. And the court's authority to enforce these customs worked both ways. A lord who violated the customs of his manor, who demanded more than the customary obligations, who seized land without legal process, who interfered with the tenant's recognized rights, could find himself facing resistance organized around the court records that documented what the customs actually were. Medieval peasants were not passive victims. They knew the law. They used it imperfectly, with enormous disadvantage against a lord who had the resources to pursue litigation indefinitely, and the authority to make life very difficult for tenants who caused him trouble. But they were not simply objects of exploitation. They were actors, limited actors, constrained actors, actors operating in a system that was profoundly stacked against them, but actors nonetheless. The village that clustered beneath the castle's walls was not the timeless, unchanging community that romantic nostalgia sometimes imagines. It was dynamic. It was connected to other villages, to the nearest market town, to the great fairs that brought merchants from across Europe together at regular intervals, to the pilgrimage routes that crossed the continent and brought strangers through even the most remote communities. It was organized around the agricultural rhythms that the climate and the soil imposed, but within those rhythms there was more variety, more agency, more human complexity than the simple image of the medieval peasant suggests. The open field system that dominated English and French and German agriculture by the high medieval period was itself a sophisticated collective technology. The village's arable land was divided into 2 or 3 large open fields, unfenced, unhedged, worked in common by all the tenants of the manor. Each field was divided into strips, and each tenant held strips scattered across all the fields rather than a contiguous holding in any one place. This seems inefficient, and by the standards of later agricultural practice it was. But it had a logic. The scattering of strips meant that the risks of a bad harvest in one part of the field were distributed across all the tenants rather than falling on one person. It enforced cooperation. Neighbors working adjacent strips had to coordinate their plowing and harvesting schedules. It required collective decision-making about crop rotation and fallow periods. The village common, the pasture and woodland that all the tenants shared, was managed through systems of regulation that prevented any individual from grazing more animals than the common could support. Stinting, the allocation of specific rights to each tenant based on the size of their holding, was not a natural right but a negotiated agreement, maintained by collective enforcement and adjusted as circumstances changed. It was, in the terminology of modern economics, a managed commons, not the tragedy of overuse that later theorists would predict, but a functioning collective institution that had been refined over generations of practical experience. The village also had its specialist workers, the blacksmith, who was as essential to the agricultural community as the priest, since without iron tools the plowing could not be done and the horses could not be shod. The miller, who operated the lord's mill where the grain had to be ground, for a fee that the peasants resented and paid, because the lord's monopoly on milling was one of the most reliably irritating features of the feudal economy. The carpenter, the tanner, the fuller who processed wool into cloth in the communities where wool production was the primary commercial activity, and the priest. The parish priest was the most important figure in the village community after the lord, and in the daily reality of most peasants' lives, considerably more important than a lord who might be absent for months at a time. The priest baptized the children, and married the couples and buried the dead. He heard confession and administered communion, and performed the Mass that connected the village to the universal church and through the church to God. He was, for most peasants, the only educated person they would ever know personally, the only person who could read and write, who understood Latin, who had access to the wider world of learning and institutional authority that lay beyond the village horizon. The priest quality varied enormously. The great medieval church, spread across thousands of parishes in a dozen countries, could not maintain consistent standards across all of them. Some parish priests were genuinely educated, devout, effective pastors. Some were barely literate, of doubtful morality, holding multiple parishes they never visited and collecting the tithes from all of them through deputies who were paid as little as possible. The Church spent the entire medieval period trying to reform the parish clergy, producing a succession of councils and regulations and reform movements, each of which achieved partial success and left the problem partially unsolved. The tithe, the 10% of agricultural produce that every householder was obligated to pay to the Church, was the economic foundation of the parish system. It was also one of the most resented obligations of rural life. Not because people objected to supporting the Church in principle, but because the tithe was collected even in bad years, even when the harvest had failed and the family was facing genuine want, even when the priest who received it was a non-resident pluralist who would not be seen in the village until it was time to collect the following year's payment. The market town was the village's window on the larger world. Most peasants lived within a day's walk of a market town. This was not accidental, it was the result of the medieval market system's logic, which required that agricultural producers be able to travel to market and return home within a single day. The weekly market was where surplus agricultural produce was sold, where manufactured goods were purchased, where news and rumor circulated, where the social world expanded briefly beyond the familiar boundaries of the village community. The great fairs were something else entirely, events that drew merchants and buyers from across Europe, that lasted days or weeks, that temporarily transformed a town into a cosmopolitan commercial space where goods from every corner of the known world changed hands. The Champagne fairs in France, the cloth fairs of Flanders, the great fair at Stourbridge near Cambridge, these were the arteries of medieval international commerce, the places where the raw wool of English sheep became the finished cloth of Flemish looms, became the money in an Italian banker's ledger, became the spices that seasoned the food at a French lord's table. The medieval economy was not the static, self-sufficient thing that older historical narratives imagined. It was integrated, commercial, dynamic, limited by the technology of transport and communication, but within those limits surprisingly sophisticated. The world of the medieval town was different in character from the world of the castle and the village, and its difference was increasingly significant as the high medieval period progressed. Towns were old in some cases, built on Roman foundations, maintaining in their street plans and sometimes in their surviving walls the ghost of the urban civilization that had preceded them. They were new in others, planted deliberately by lords who understood that a thriving market town was a source of revenue and a magnet for the specialized labor that a developing economy required. They were growing through the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries, as agricultural productivity increased and surplus population moved off the land and into the urban economy. The towns occupied a peculiar position in the feudal system. They did not fit neatly into the hierarchy of lord and vassal and serf. The merchant who had made his fortune in the cloth trade, the master craftsman whose guild controlled the production and sale of metal goods in his city, the lawyer who had studied at Bologna or Paris, and whose skills were available to whoever could pay for them, these people existed in the gaps of the feudal order, in spaces that the system had not been designed to accommodate, and did not handle with particular grace. The guilds were the town's most characteristic institution, those associations of craftsmen and merchants that regulated the production and sale of goods in their specific trade, that maintained quality standards, that controlled entry into the profession through the apprenticeship system, that provided mutual support for their members in illness and old age, and that accumulated, over time, significant economic and political power within their cities. The apprenticeship system was the guild's mechanism for reproducing its own expertise. A boy of 10 or 12 was bound to a master craftsman for a period of years, typically 7, though the term varied, during which he lived in the master's household, learned the trade through practical experience under supervision, received no wages but was fed and housed and clothed, and at the end of his term emerged as a journeyman, a qualified craftsman who could work for wages but could not yet practice independently. After years as a journeyman, if he could produce a masterpiece, a piece of work that demonstrated mastery of his craft to the satisfaction of the guild's masters, he could become a master himself, open his own shop, take his own apprentices. The system was conservative by design. It controlled the number of practitioners in each trade. It maintained standards. It prevented rapid technical change by embedding knowledge in the slow process of personal transmission from master to apprentice. It could be exploited by established masters who had an interest in keeping the number of competitors limited. But it also produced, over centuries, a level of craft skill, in metalwork, in textile production, in architecture, in the making of glass and ceramic and leather and wood, that remains, in many of its achievements, unsurpassed. The great cathedrals were the town's most dramatic statement of communal ambition, and they were communal in a way that is easy to underestimate from a modern perspective that tends to attribute great works to individual genius rather than collective effort. A medieval cathedral took generations to build. The master mason who began the foundations in 1 century would be dead before the nave was complete. His successor might modify the design. His successor's successor might add a new chapel or change the design of the towers. The building accumulated over time, carrying within its stones the evidence of changing fashion and changing resources and changing ambition, each generation leaving its mark on a structure that belonged, ultimately, not to any individual but to the community and the faith that had produced it. The great Gothic cathedrals of France and England and Germany, Chartres, Notre Dame, Salisbury, Cologne, are among the most extraordinary structures human beings have ever built. Their engineering was, for its time, almost impossibly ambitious. The pointed arch and the flying buttress, those two technical innovations that distinguished Gothic from Romanesque architecture, allowed the builders to reduce the weight carried by the walls and transfer it outward and downward through the buttressing system, making it possible to open the walls to enormous windows filled with stained glass that flooded the interior with colored light. The effect was deliberate and calculated. Walking into a great Gothic cathedral was supposed to feel like walking into heaven, the light transformed, the ordinary world left behind, the space opening upward in a way that seemed to deny the weight of the stone, the colored glass filtering the sunlight into something that had never existed in nature. The architecture was theology made physical. It was an argument about what God was like, rendered in stone and glass and the mathematics of structural engineering. The craftsmen who built these structures, the masons and carpenters and glaziers and metalworkers, were not anonymous. We know the names of some of them. We know that the master masons who designed and supervised the construction of the great cathedrals were among the most technically sophisticated people of their age, that they traveled from one great project to another carrying expertise that was in constant demand, that they developed, slowly, through apprenticeship and accumulated practical experience, a structural understanding that was empirical rather than mathematical but was no less real for that. They built things that have stood for 800 years. They did not know the calculus. They did not have structural engineering in the modern sense. They had experience, and judgment, and the particular courage of people who were willing to push materials to the edge of their capacity because the alternative, a church that looked like all the other churches, was simply not good enough. That courage, that ambition, that refusal to accept the merely adequate, this is one of the things the medieval world produced that deserves to be remembered alongside its violence, and its injustice, and its terrible mortality. The rhythm of the medieval year was governed by two calendars that overlaid each other constantly: the agricultural calendar and the liturgical calendar. The agricultural calendar was ancient, older than Christianity, older than Rome, rooted in the basic biological realities of the northern European climate. Plowing in February and March, when the ground was soft enough to work. Planting in April and May. The long labor of tending through summer, weeding, maintaining drainage, keeping animals from the growing crops. Harvest in August and September, the most critical weeks of the year, when the entire community's survival for the coming 12 months depended on getting the grain in before the autumn rains came and rotted it in the field. And then the quieter months of winter, when the heavy work was impossible and the shorter days and the cold imposed a different rhythm of life. Indoor tasks, repairs, the slaughter of animals that could not be fed through the winter and whose salted meat would sustain the household through the lean months of early spring. The liturgical calendar was Christianity's overlay on this agricultural reality, the cycle of feasts and fasts and saints' days and seasons that gave the year its religious meaning. Advent and Christmas, Lent and Easter, Pentecost. The long sequence of saints' days that punctuated every month, each saint associated with specific protections and specific celebrations, each feast day a break from ordinary work, a gathering at the church, a communal acknowledgement of the sacred dimension of time. The two calendars were not in conflict. They were integrated. Christianity had been careful, from its earliest penetration of the European countryside, to locate its festivals at or near the existing seasonal celebrations, absorbing the older rhythms into the new framework rather than simply displacing them. The midwinter celebration became Christmas. The spring fertility festival became Easter. The midsummer fire festivals were Christianized as the feast of Saint John the Baptist. The old sacred days were not abolished. They were renamed and given new theological content while retaining much of their practical character, the feasting, the fire, the gathering of community. For the peasant, the liturgical year was not primarily theology. It was structure. It was the framework within which ordinary life had meaning, the dates that organized memory and anticipation, the celebrations that broke the monotony of agricultural labor, the fasts that imposed discipline and the feasts that released it, the sacred calendar that told you where you were in time and what the time required of you. The Feast of Corpus Christi. The Feast of the Assumption. All Saints' Day. All Souls' Day. That particular medieval invention, the day set aside to pray for the dead in purgatory, which gave families a ritual space for the grief that the extraordinary mortality of medieval life produced in quantities that could not be accommodated in private. The mystery plays, those extraordinary pieces of popular theater that developed in England and France and Germany through the 14th and 15th centuries, were the liturgical calendar made dramatic. Performed on wagons that moved through the streets of the town, stopping at different points to perform successive episodes of the biblical story before a standing audience, the mystery plays were simultaneously entertainment and education and religious experience. They told the entire story of Christian salvation, from the fall of Lucifer through the creation and fall of man through the life of Christ through the Last Judgment, in vernacular language, with comedy and pathos and a directness of dramatic imagination that reached people who had no Latin and no access to the theological learning of the universities. The Wakefield Master's Second Shepherd's Play, a mystery play from the Wakefield cycle in northern England, probably dating from the late 14th or early 15th century, contains a scene in which a sheep thief hides a stolen sheep in a cradle and pretends it is his newborn child, in a comic parody of the nativity that immediately precedes the actual nativity scene it is parodying. It is one of the earliest examples of dramatic irony in the English language. It is also hilarious. The medieval audience that watched it was not choosing between sacred and secular experience. They were experiencing both simultaneously, in the same performance, and finding that the combination was richer than either would have been alone. This capacity for holding the sacred and the comic together, for finding the divine in the ridiculous, for laughing in church without any sense that laughter and reverence were incompatible, is one of the things the medieval world understood about human experience that later, more earnest centuries tended to lose. Chaucer understood it. The Knight's Tale and the Miller's Tale exist in the same collection, told by pilgrims on the same road to the same shrine. The noble and the bawdy, the tragic and the farcical. The medieval imagination was large enough to hold all of it. The feudal system that organized all of this, the castle and the village, the lord and the peasant, the guild and the cathedral, the agricultural year and the liturgical calendar, was not, in the end, permanent. Nothing in history is permanent. But feudalism's impermanence was written into its structure from the beginning, in ways that became visible only gradually and that were accelerated by events, the Black Death above all, but also the economic changes of the high medieval period, the growth of the towns, the development of royal administration, the gradual reconceptualization of what governance meant and where authority came from. The feudal system had been built on a particular understanding of land and labor and loyalty. The idea that land was the source of all wealth, that the people who worked the land were the fundamental economic unit, and that the political organization of society should reflect the military reality of mounted warriors who needed land to support their equipment and training, and who exchanged military service for the right to extract income from the people who worked their estates. This understanding was not wrong, exactly, for the world it described. The 9th and 10th centuries, when feudalism was taking shape, were genuinely dominated by land-based agriculture and the military technology of the mounted knight. The institutions of feudalism, the castle, the manor, the systems of homage and service, were rational responses to real conditions. But the conditions were changing. Trade was growing. The commercial revolution of the 11th and 12th centuries, the expansion of long-distance trade, the development of Italian banking, the growth of the great cloth towns of Flanders and England, was creating wealth that was not land and not labor but capital, money that could be invested and multiplied, that could buy military power without the slow process of feudal obligation. That gave its possessors a flexibility and a reach that land-based wealth could not match. The towns were growing. The populations that concentrated in the commercial cities of northern Italy and the Low Countries and the English ports were not peasants tied to manorial estates. They were free, legally, economically, increasingly in a social sense as well. The townsman who had built a business through his own effort and intelligence did not experience himself as a dependent in the way that the feudal ideology required. He experienced himself as a person with rights, with the right to conduct his business without arbitrary interference, to pass his property to his heirs, to have disputes resolved by law rather than by the personal authority of a lord. The towns fought for these rights and obtained them, in charters, granted by kings and lords who needed the town's money and who understood that granting legal rights cost less than the alternative. The charter of a medieval town was a document of extraordinary significance, a written guarantee of specific freedoms that the townspeople could invoke against any lord who tried to interfere with them. It was an early, halting, incomplete expression of the idea that rights exist independently of the personal will of the powerful, that there are things a lord cannot do to a free townsman, not because the lord lacks the physical power to do them but because the law says he cannot. This idea, the idea of rights secured by law rather than personal relationship, was incompatible with the fundamental logic of feudalism, which was built on personal relationships all the way down. The vassal's obligation to his lord was personal. The serf's bond to the manor was personal. The entire system ran on the specific human relationships between specific individuals, bound by specific oaths and specific customs. When those individuals died, the relationships had to be recreated, the oaths resworn, the customs renegotiated. Law was different. Law persisted across individual deaths. Law was, in principle, the same for everyone subject to it. Law could grow and develop through the accumulation of precedent without requiring the parties to renegotiate it from scratch with every new generation. The growth of royal law, the slow, contested, century-long process by which the kings of England and France built up their own legal systems at the expense of the private jurisdiction of the great lords, was one of the most important political developments of the high medieval period. And it was a development that was fundamentally corrosive of the feudal order, because it took the resolution of disputes, the core function that the Lord's court had exercised over his tenants, out of the Lord's hands and into the king's. Henry II of England, in the middle of the 12th century, expanded the reach of royal justice into areas that had previously been handled by manorial and baronial courts. He created the common law, a body of royal legal procedures available to free men throughout England, regardless of which lord's territory they happened to live in. This was not, from Henry's perspective, an ideological project. It was a revenue stream and a source of political power. Cases in royal courts generated fees for the crown, and the king's ability to hear cases that had previously gone to baronial courts reduced the power of the barons at the king's expense. But the consequence, whether intended or not, was the gradual creation of an alternative to the lord's jurisdiction. A free man who had a dispute with his neighbor no longer had to rely on the lord's court and the lord's conception of justice. He could appeal to the king's court, to royal common law, to a system of rights and procedures that was in principle the same whether you were in Yorkshire or Kent. This was the beginning of something that would take centuries to fully develop. But its direction was clear, even at the beginning. The relationship between the individual and the state, that particular relationship, mediated by law rather than personal loyalty, that defines the modern understanding of citizenship, was taking its first tentative shape in the legal developments of the 12th century. The feudal world was not dying. Not yet. It had centuries of life ahead of it in various forms, different in different regions, more persistent in some places than others. But the seeds of its replacement had been planted. In the towns and the trade routes and the growing royal courts and the slowly accumulating precedents of common law, the world that would succeed feudalism was beginning to assemble itself. It would take the Black Death to accelerate the process. It would take the 100 Years' War and the Wars of the Roses and a dozen other conflicts to work out the political implications. It would take the printing press and the Reformation and the scientific revolution to complete the transformation. But the direction was set. Had been set, arguably, since the moment the first merchant in a Flemish cloth town had looked at the Lord's tollgate on the road and calculated that the toll was costing him more than the protection was worth. The castle still stood on the hill. The Lord still held his court. The peasant still paid his dues and worked his strips and attended his church and lived and died in the village where he had been born. But something had changed. Something small and slow and barely visible, the way that the first crack in a wall is invisible until the day it isn't. The world the castle had organized was beginning, slowly, to organize itself differently. And on the horizon, just visible through the arrow slits of those ancient walls, the shape of the next world was beginning to appear. There is a moment, not a single moment, not a date you can circle on a calendar, but a gradual accumulation of moments that eventually tips into something irreversible, when people stop thinking of themselves primarily as subjects of a lord and start thinking of themselves as something else. As members of a people. As inhabitants of a place. As French or English or Castilian or Portuguese. As something that exists independently of whichever king happens to be sitting on the throne, independently of which lord happens to hold the local castle, independently of the Church's universal claim on the souls of all Christians everywhere. As citizens of a nation. This shift, this slow, contested, centuries-long transformation in the way that people understood their primary political identity, is one of the most consequential developments in the history of the Western world. It produced the nation-states that still organize the political map of Europe today. It produced the idea of national sovereignty, the principle that a defined territory has the right to govern itself according to its own laws without interference from outside powers. It produced nationalism, that powerful, dangerous, sometimes magnificent and sometimes catastrophic sense of collective identity that has driven both the greatest and the most terrible events of the modern world. And it began, like so many of the medieval world's most consequential developments, not as a philosophical project but as a practical response to immediate problems. The immediate problem, in the late medieval period, was war. Not just any war. A particular war, the longest, most destructive, most politically transformative conflict of the medieval period, a war that lasted, with interruptions, for 116 years and that changed France and England so thoroughly that the countries that emerged from it bore only a superficial resemblance to the countries that had entered it. The 100 Years' War. It began, technically, in 1337. It ended, technically, in 1453. In between, it consumed 4 generations of soldiers and civilians, destroyed enormous tracts of the French countryside, produced some of the most dramatic military reversals in European history, gave the world one of its most enduring historical figures in Joan of Arc, and, almost accidentally, almost as a side effect of all the killing, forged in the populations of both England and France a sense of national identity that had not existed with anything like its eventual intensity before the war began. To understand how a war creates a nation, you have to understand what the war was actually about. It was about inheritance. About the specific, technical, legally contested question of who had the right to sit on the throne of France. Edward III of England, whose mother Isabella had been a daughter of the French king Philip IV, claimed that this gave him a better claim to the French throne than Philip VI of Valois, who had been crowned king of France in 1328 when the male Catelyn line died out. The French disagreed, invoking the Salic law, which excluded inheritance through the female line, and arguing that an English king ruling France was a self-evident absurdity regardless of the technicalities of dynastic succession. This was the formal cause. The real causes were older and more complex. The English crown's possession of large territories in France, inherited from the Norman conquest and the Angevin Empire, that the French kings had been trying to recover for a century. The economic rivalry over the wool trade and the Flemish cloth towns that depended on English wool and French political domination in roughly equal measure. The specific personal ambitions of specific kings at specific moments. The structural tendency of medieval kingdoms to go to war when their kings were strong enough to fight and the legal pretexts were available. But whatever caused the war, what it produced was something that none of its architects had intended. It produced Frenchness and Englishness, and the idea that these were real things, not merely political jurisdictions but genuine communities of people who shared something essential, something worth dying for, something that distinguished them from the people on the other side of the channel and the other side of the battlefield. This idea did not arrive fully formed. It grew, slowly, painfully, through 100 years of fighting and dying and losing and occasionally winning, through the experience of being invaded and the experience of invading, through the particular alchemy of shared suffering that turns a collection of subjects into something that feels more like a people. The war's early years belonged to England. Edward III was one of the most militarily gifted kings England had ever produced, a commander who combined personal courage with genuine strategic intelligence, who understood the relationship between military success and political authority in ways that his contemporaries found almost uncanny. He rebuilt the English army, developing the combination of dismounted men-at-arms and longbowmen that would prove, over the following century, to be the most effective tactical system in Western Europe. The English longbow was the war's defining weapon in its early phases, not because it was new, but because the English had developed the training system that made its full potential available. A longbow was not a weapon you picked up and used. It required years of practice, beginning in childhood, developing the specific muscle structure of the left shoulder and the draw arm that allowed a trained archer to loose 12 aimed arrows per minute at ranges of up to 300 yards. The skeletons of medieval English archers are identifiable by their deformities. The overdevelopment of the left arm and shoulder, the spinal curvature produced by years of drawing a bow that required 150 pounds of force to string. At Cressy in 1346, these archers, positioned on a slope, shooting downhill into the advancing French army, destroyed wave after wave of French cavalry with a volume of fire that the armored knights had no answer for. The French charged 16 times. 16 times the arrows came. The slope in front of the English position was covered with dead horses and dying men. Philip VI fled the field. The English losses were minimal. Crécy was followed by Poitiers in 1356, where the Black Prince, Edward's son, captured the French King John II in person, an extraordinary humiliation that demonstrated, more clearly than any number of battlefield victories, the dysfunction of the French political system. A kingdom whose king could be taken prisoner in battle was a kingdom in serious trouble. And then, in 1415, Agincourt. Henry V of England, young, intensely pious, possessed of a military intelligence that matched his grandfather Edward III and a personal charisma that the chronicles find difficult to describe without resorting to superlatives, invaded France with an army that was, by any rational military assessment, too small for the task he had set it. The French army that met him near the village of Agincourt on October 25, 1415, St. Crispin's Day, outnumbered the English perhaps 3 or 4 to 1. Henry positioned his archers on a narrow front between two woods, eliminating the possibility of the French cavalry working around his flanks. He had sharpened stakes driven into the ground before the archer lines to break a cavalry charge. He waited. The French, after a long standoff, advanced. The ground between the armies had been soaked by recent rain, and the heavily armored French men-at-arms, crowding forward in a narrow front, sank into the mud with every step. The English archers opened fire at close range. The French advance dissolved into a struggling, crowded mass of men too heavily armored to move freely in deep mud, being shot from both flanks by bowmen who could loose their arrows almost as fast as they could draw them. The slaughter was extraordinary. The French lost perhaps 6,000 men. The English lost perhaps 500. Henry V returned to England a hero of mythological dimensions, a king who had done what medieval kings were supposed to do, had won a great victory against overwhelming odds, had demonstrated God's favor toward England and the English cause with a clarity that theological argument could not have achieved. Shakespeare would later give him the words that captured what Agincourt meant, or came to mean, for English national identity. The St. Crispin's Day speech. "We few, we happy few, we band of brothers." The words are Shakespeare's, written 200 years after the battle. But the sentiment they express, the particular pride of shared suffering and shared victory that binds a community together more tightly than any formal institution, that was real. It was something the war was actually producing, in the men who fought it and in the populations that watched and waited and prayed. The Treaty of Troyes in 1420 seemed to give England everything. Henry V was recognized as heir to the French throne, bypassing the Dauphin, the French crown prince, on the grounds of his alleged illegitimacy. Henry married Catherine of Valois, the French king's daughter. The crowns of England and France would be united on Henry's head when the mad French King Charles VI died. Henry V died first. In 1422, at the age of 35, of dysentery during the siege of Meaux, before he had ever sat on the French throne. His son, Henry VI, was 9 months old. The war continued. But something had changed in France. Something that would ultimately determine the war's outcome more decisively than any battle. The French had found something worth fighting for. She was born around 1412 in a village called Domremy on the border between France and the Duchy of Bar. Her father was a prosperous peasant, a man of some local standing, literate enough to have served as a village official, substantial enough to own land. Her mother was devout, had made the pilgrimage to Rome, raised her children with the particular intensity of faith that the late medieval period produced in certain people, a faith that was personal and immediate and completely certain, that felt the presence of the sacred in the world with the directness that the institutional church sometimes found as unsettling as it was inspiring. Her name was Joan. The English called her Joan. From around the age of 13, she began hearing voices. Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, Saint Margaret. The voices were specific, commanding, increasingly urgent. They told her that God had chosen her for a mission, to go to the Dauphin, the uncrowned heir to the French throne, to lead the French army to the relief of Orleans, and to see Charles VII crowned King of France at Reims, in the cathedral where French kings had been crowned for centuries. She was, when she presented herself to the local commander at Vaucouleurs in 1429, 17 years old. She had never handled a weapon. She had never ridden a warhorse. She had never attended a royal court. She had no military training, no political connections, no formal education beyond the basic religious instruction of a peasant childhood. She was also, by every account that survives from people who actually met her, extraordinary. Not in appearance. The sources agree that she was unremarkable physically, a sturdy peasant girl with dark hair who cut it short when she adopted men's clothing, which she did almost immediately upon beginning her mission. The extraordinariness was in something else, in the absolute, unshakable certainty of her conviction, in the quality of her presence, in the effect she had on the men around her. Hardened soldiers who had been fighting this war for years found themselves believing her. Commanders who had every rational reason to dismiss her as a deluded peasant girl found themselves following her orders. The Dauphin, Charles, a man of limited confidence and considerable political calculation, received her after tests designed to expose a fraud. He was not easily convinced, but he was desperate. The military situation in 1429 was as bad as it had ever been. Orleans, the key city of the Loire Valley, had been under English siege for months. If Orleans fell, the road to the south of France, the only part of the country still loyal to the French crown, would be open. The Dauphin would be finished. Joan was given armor. She was given a horse. She was given command, formally. She was attached to the army in a somewhat undefined capacity, technically under the authority of professional commanders. In practice, from the moment she arrived at the French camp, she was the one making the decisions that mattered. She rode to Orleans on April 29, 1429. Within 9 days, the siege was broken. The professional military commanders had been besieging Orleans for 7 months without achieving this. Joan achieved it in 9 days. Not through tactical genius. Her approach to siege warfare was straightforward to the point of recklessness, a preference for direct assault that horrified her more cautious colleagues. But through something else, through the effect she had on the French soldiers, who fought with an energy and a confidence in those 9 days that they had not shown for years. The voices she heard, whatever their origin, had given her a certainty that was contagious. And certainty, in a war that the French had been losing for decades, was the rarest and most valuable resource available. After Orleans came the Loire campaign, a series of engagements in which the French, under Joan's practical direction and with a momentum they had not possessed in a generation, cleared the English from the Loire Valley with a speed that left the English commanders unable to respond effectively. Patay, in June 1429, was the decisive engagement. The English archers, who had devastated French cavalry at Crécy and Poitiers and Agincourt, were caught before they could set their defensive formation and were overrun by French cavalry in a reversal so complete that the English losses were catastrophic. The road to Reims was open. Joan led the Dauphin there in July 1429, through territory that was technically under English or Burgundian control, in a march that should have been impossibly dangerous, and that the English and their Burgundian allies failed, somehow, to effectively interrupt. On July 17, 1429, Charles VII was crowned King of France in the Cathedral of Reims, with Joan of Arc standing beside him, her standard. She had insisted on this. being present at the ceremony because it had shared in the labor and deserved to share in the honor. It was the moment she had been told, by the voices, to achieve. Everything after it would be a descent. She was captured the following year. In May 1430, during a skirmish near Compiègne, Joan was pulled from her horse by a Burgundian soldier and taken prisoner. The Burgundians, French nobles who had allied with England against the French crown, in one of the most consequential political decisions of the entire 100 Years' War, sold her to the English for 10,000 livres. A king's ransom, literally, for a peasant girl. Charles VII made no attempt to ransom her. The man whose coronation she had made possible, whose cause she had revived at its lowest point, whose crown she had effectively placed on his head through her certainty and her courage, Charles did nothing. Whether from calculation, Joan had become politically inconvenient, her divine authority a potential rival to royal authority, or from simple cowardice, or from the cold pragmatism of a medieval king who understood that gratitude was a luxury that politics could not afford, he abandoned her. The English tried her for heresy. The trial of Joan of Arc, conducted between January and May 1431 by an ecclesiastical court headed by the Bishop of Beauvais, Pierre Cauchon, was one of the most thoroughly documented legal proceedings of the medieval period. The transcript runs to hundreds of pages and has been studied by scholars for 6 centuries. It was also, by any honest assessment, a judicial murder. The charges were designed to be impossible to answer. She was accused of heresy on the basis of her voices. The claim that her divine guidance came directly from God rather than through the mediation of the Church was, technically, a claim that the Church could not accept. She was accused of wearing men's clothing, which she had done throughout her military career and which was treated as evidence of a disordered and sinful nature. She was accused of various offenses against proper feminine conduct and proper ecclesiastical authority, all constructed to reach a predetermined conclusion. She defended herself with extraordinary skill. The transcript shows a young woman of quick intelligence and considerable presence, who understood what was being done to her and fought it with the weapons she had: clarity of thought, precision of language, the occasional flash of wit that even hostile contemporaries recorded with something approaching admiration. When asked whether she knew she was in the grace of God, a trap question, since if she said yes she was claiming to know God's mind, which was heresy, and if she said no she was admitting to being a sinner in a state of potential damnation, she answered, "If I am not, may God put me there. If I am, may God keep me there." Her questioners had no response. But the outcome was never in doubt. She was condemned. Offered the chance to recant and save her life, she initially signed a document of abjuration, and then withdrew it, in one of the most extraordinary acts of individual courage in the historical record, understanding perfectly that withdrawing her recantation meant death. On May 30, 1431, Joan of Arc was burned at the stake in the marketplace of Rouen. She was 19 years old. She asked for a cross to hold, and an English soldier made her one from 2 sticks. She is reported to have repeated the name of Jesus until the flames silenced her. The English had burned a saint. They would realize this, eventually. The Church would realize it too. 25 years after her execution, a rehabilitation trial declared her conviction invalid. In 1920, the Catholic Church canonized her. She is Saint Joan of Arc, patron of France. But the more immediate consequence of her life and death was what she had already done, what could not be undone by burning. She had shown that France could win. She had broken the psychological grip of English military dominance that had held since Crusades, had demonstrated that the English were not invincible, had given the French army back the thing it had lost somewhere in the long years of defeat. Not tactics, not better weapons, belief. The war continued for another 22 years after Joan's death. But the momentum had shifted. The Burgundians reconciled with the French crown in 1435, a diplomatic revolution that removed the most important English ally from the field. Normandy was reconquered in 1450. Gascony, the last major English holding in France, fell in 1453. The 100 Years' War was over. England held nothing in France except Calais, a single port town on the Channel coast that would remain in English hands for another century, a last vestige of the empire that had stretched from Scotland's border to the Pyrenees 400 years before. France was French. Entirely, unmistakably, for the first time in its history, French, governed by a French king, speaking French, developing a French literature and a French legal tradition and a French sense of what it meant to be French that had been forged in the furnace of 100 years of war against an enemy that had been just different enough to define Frenchness by contrast. The nation-state had not yet been invented, but France had taken a very large step toward becoming one. England, meanwhile, was tearing itself apart. The 100 Years' War had ended in defeat. The territories in France that English kings had held for generations were gone. The enormous cost of the war, in money, in men, in the accumulated political capital of a monarchy that had promised victory and delivered catastrophe, had created a crisis of royal authority that the particular weakness of Henry VI made impossible to manage. Henry VI was not equipped for his situation. He was a gentleman, genuinely, perhaps even constitutionally gentle, incapable of the strategic cruelty that medieval kingship regularly required, prone to periods of catatonic withdrawal that modern scholarship suggests were episodes of mental illness, surrounded by factions of powerful nobles who competed for control of a king who could not effectively control himself. Into this vacuum stepped the great noble houses, the Plantagenet families who had accumulated land and retinues and local power through decades of service in the French wars and who now turned that power on each other in the dynastic conflict that would eventually receive the romantically misleading name of the Wars of the Roses. The name comes from the badges of the two factions, the Red Rose of Lancaster, the White Rose of York. In reality, the roses were minor features of a conflict that was substantially more brutal than floral heraldry suggests, a dynastic struggle for the English throne between two branches of the royal Plantagenet family, each claiming descent from Edward III by different lines, each supported by networks of noble clients whose own fortunes were tied to the success of their chosen claimant. The conflict lasted, with periods of relative peace, from 1455 to 1485. It produced a bewildering sequence of kings: Henry VI restored, Edward IV deposed, Edward IV restored, Henry VI restored again, Edward IV again, the brief and sinister reign of Richard III, each change of dynasty accompanied by executions of the defeated claimants and their supporters, attainders that stripped families of their lands and their legal standing. The grinding elimination of the noble houses that had made the war possible in the first place. By the time it ended, the great magnate families that had dominated English political life for a century were substantially weakened, killed in battle, executed after defeat, their estates confiscated, their retinues dispersed. The power that had been theirs flowed, in the absence of competitors, toward the crown. The man who picked up the pieces in 1485 was Henry Tudor, a Welshman with a somewhat tenuous claim to the throne through an illegitimate Lancastrian line, who had spent most of his life in exile in Brittany and who landed on the Welsh coast in August 1485 with a small army of French mercenaries and Welsh supporters and marched into England to claim a throne he had never sat on. At the Battle of Bosworth Field on August 22, 1485, Richard III, the last Plantagenet king, was killed when his cavalry charge into the enemy lines failed to reach Henry Tudor before Richard's own allies, the Stanley family, switched sides and struck Richard's exposed force from the flank. Richard was killed, his body stripped and carried from the field on the back of a horse, his crown, which had fallen from his helmet in the battle, placed on Henry Tudor's head by Thomas Stanley on the field itself. Henry VII, as Henry Tudor became, was not an inspiring figure in the way that Henry V had been inspiring. He was careful, suspicious, financially acute, politically calculating, not inclined to the grand gesture or the heroic display. He was exactly what England needed after 30 years of dynastic chaos. He secured his claim by marrying Elizabeth of York, the daughter of Edward IV, uniting the Lancastrian and Yorkist claims in a single dynastic line whose badge combined the red and white roses into the Tudor rose. He rebuilt the royal finances, exhausted by a century of war and political instability, through careful management and the vigorous enforcement of royal rights that had been allowed to lapse. He kept England out of expensive foreign wars. He suppressed the private armies, the retinues of liveried followers that the great nobles had maintained throughout the Wars of the Roses and that were the institutional basis of the magnate power that had made those wars possible. The Tudor state was not yet the centralized bureaucratic monarchy of the 16th century. But it was moving in that direction. The King's Council was becoming a professional administrative body. The royal courts were expanding their jurisdiction at the expense of baronial justice. The royal revenue was being managed with a sophistication that English government had not seen since the Norman kings of the 11th century. England was not yet a nation-state. But it was becoming a state, a coherent, centrally governed political entity in which the king's authority was real and effective, and not dependent on the cooperation of magnates who might withdraw that cooperation at any moment. This was new. Not entirely new, the process had been underway for centuries. But the Wars of the Roses had accelerated it catastrophically, by eliminating the noble competition that had constrained royal authority for so long. The Tudors inherited a weakened aristocracy and a strengthened crown. What they built on that foundation would eventually produce a form of governance that was recognizably modern, not medieval, not feudal, but something else, something that would have been incomprehensible to Charlemagne and surprising even to Henry II. Something that looked, from a sufficient distance, like a nation. Across Europe, the same process was working itself out in different ways and at different speeds, driven by the same underlying forces: the growth of royal power, the decline of feudal fragmentation, the increasing importance of law and administration over personal loyalty, the gradual emergence of something like national consciousness in populations that shared a language and a territory and a common history of conflict. In Spain, the marriage of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile in 1469 united the two largest kingdoms of the Iberian Peninsula into a personal union that would eventually become the Kingdom of Spain. The Reconquista, the 700-year project of recovering the Iberian Peninsula from Muslim rule, was completed in 1492, when the last Muslim kingdom of Granada fell to Ferdinand and Isabella's forces. In the same year, Christopher Columbus sailed west from a Spanish port and arrived in the Americas, beginning a process of expansion that would make Spain the most powerful state in Europe within a generation. Ferdinand and Isabella were not building a modern nation-state in any conscious sense. They were doing what medieval monarchs did: consolidating territory, asserting authority, pursuing dynastic advantage and religious goals that were inseparable in the mental framework of the age. But the machinery they built, the centralized administration, the unified legal system, the Inquisition as an instrument of religious and political conformity, the professional army, was more sophisticated and more effective than anything the feudal world had produced. In Portugal, a tiny kingdom on the western edge of Europe, a series of remarkable kings had been sending ships down the coast of Africa since the early 15th century, beginning the process of oceanic exploration that would eventually connect every part of the world to the European commercial network. Bartholomew Diaz rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1488. Vasco da Gama reached India in 1498. The Portuguese were not motivated primarily by intellectual curiosity, though some of them were curious. They were motivated by spice, by the enormous commercial advantage of finding a sea route to the spices of Asia that bypassed the overland trade routes controlled by Ottoman and Arab intermediaries. The spice trade seems, from a sufficient distance, like a mundane commercial motivation for world historical exploration. But spices were not mundane in the 15th century. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, these were luxury goods of enormous value, used to preserve food, to season it, to demonstrate the wealth of those who could afford them. The markup between the price at source in the Spice Islands and the price in a European market was several thousand%. The country that controlled the sea route to Asia would control one of the most profitable commercial networks in the world. Portugal controlled it briefly, then Spain, then the Dutch, then England. The competition for commercial advantage in the newly connected world would drive European politics and European warfare for the next 4 centuries. It would produce the colonial empires that remade the entire world. It would generate the wealth that funded the Renaissance and the Reformation and the Scientific Revolution. And it would create the global economic system, unequal, exploitative, and productive of extraordinary innovation, that we still inhabit. All of this lay in the future. But its seeds were being planted in the late medieval period, in the same decades that the 100 Years' War was forging French and English national identity, and the Wars of the Roses were strengthening the English crown, and Ferdinand and Isabella were unifying Spain. The medieval world was ending. Not with a single dramatic event. History does not provide those clean endings, those moments when everything changes simultaneously. It was ending the way it had begun, the way everything changes, gradually, unevenly, differently in different places, with enormous amounts of the old surviving into the new and enormous amounts of the new growing from the roots of the old. The printing press arrived in Europe in the 1440s. Johannes Gutenberg's movable type press, developed in the German city of Mainz, beginning the process of mechanical reproduction that would transform the relationship between knowledge and power more thoroughly than anything since the invention of writing. By 1500, there were printing presses in every major city in Europe and millions of books in circulation, more books than had existed in all of Europe in the year 1400. The implications were incalculable. The Church had controlled access to written knowledge for 1,000 years. Not through deliberate censorship, though censorship existed, but through the simple fact that books were expensive, scarce, and located in institutions that the Church controlled. The printing press destroyed this monopoly. Ideas could now travel faster than the Church's ability to evaluate and respond to them. The Reformation, Martin Luther's challenge to papal authority, beginning in 1517, would have been impossible without the printing press. Luther's theses were printed and distributed across Germany in weeks. The Church's response, which had taken months when dealing with earlier heresies, was too slow. The debate had already happened without waiting for institutional approval. The universities had been spreading since the 12th century: Bologna, Paris, Oxford, Cambridge, Salamanca, Prague, Vienna, producing graduates in law and medicine and theology and philosophy who brought a certain kind of rational, systematic thinking to the problems of governance and commerce and natural inquiry. The university-trained lawyer was replacing the feudal lord as the primary mechanism of governance. The trained physician was beginning, very slowly, very tentatively, to challenge the Galenic medical tradition that had been essentially unchanged for 1,000 years. And the artists of Italy were looking at the ruins of Rome with new eyes. The Renaissance, that extraordinary flowering of art and learning and the recovery of classical antiquity that transformed Italian culture in the 15th century and European culture in the 16th, was not a sudden awakening from medieval darkness. The older narrative, the Middle Ages as 1,000 years of ignorance and superstition, the Renaissance as the rediscovery of reason and beauty, is wrong in almost every particular. The medieval world had its own reason and its own beauty. Chartres Cathedral is not the product of ignorance. The Summa Theologica of Thomas Aquinas is not superstition. The legal innovations of Henry II and the financial innovations of the Italian banking houses and the poetic achievement of Dante and Chaucer, these are not the works of people stumbling in darkness. What the Renaissance represented was not the discovery of reason but a change in what reason was applied to, and how, and with what confidence. A shift in the center of gravity of human inquiry, from God to man, from the eternal to the temporal, from the question of salvation to the question of how to live well in this world, from the authority of Scripture and tradition to the authority of observation and experience. This shift had been prepared by everything that had happened in the preceding 3 centuries. The Black Death had sharpened the awareness of human fragility and human individuality. The 100 Years' War had forged national identities that placed the human community in history rather than outside it. The growth of commerce and the towns had created a class of people whose success depended on their own ability and initiative rather than on inherited position or divine favor. The universities had spread the habit of systematic rational inquiry. The contact with the Islamic world, through the Crusades, through trade, through the gradual transmission of Greek philosophy preserved in Arabic, had brought back the full range of classical learning that the medieval West had been working with only fragments of. Dante Alighieri, writing in the early 14th century, had created in the Divine Comedy the most ambitious literary achievement of the medieval world, a poem that encompassed all of Christian theology and all of classical learning and all of Dante's personal grief and anger and love in a single vast structure of extraordinary formal complexity. It was written not in Latin but in Italian, in the vernacular language of Florence, the language that Dante's neighbors spoke in the streets. This was a statement as much as a choice, the claim that the vernacular was capable of the highest literary seriousness, that the world of learning did not require Latin to be real. Petrarch, a generation after Dante, developed the lyric poem in Italian into a form of introspective self-examination that would shape European poetry for 3 centuries. He was also the first to articulate, with something like conscious intention, the idea that the preceding millennium had been a period of darkness from which humanist learning was rescuing civilization, the first person to use the idea of a dark age as a literary and historical concept. He was wrong about the darkness, but the self-consciousness of the claim, the sense that something new was being made, that the present was different from the past in ways that mattered, was itself something new. Brunelleschi, in the 1420s, solved the engineering problem of the Florentine cathedral's dome, a dome that had been planned for a century without anyone knowing how to actually build it, whose dimensions required a structural solution that Roman concrete could not provide. He invented a way. He studied the Pantheon in Rome, the surviving Roman structures of his own city, the mathematical principles of architecture, and he built the dome that still stands, 8 million bricks, a double-shell structure of extraordinary ingenuity, the largest masonry dome ever constructed, rising above Florence as a statement of what human intelligence and human ambition could achieve. Donatello, working in the same decades, produced sculptures of the human figure with a psychological depth and a physical realism that had not been seen since antiquity. His David, the first freestanding nude male sculpture since Roman times, is simultaneously a meditation on youth and beauty and violence and triumph that transcends any simple allegorical reading. It is a human being, rendered in bronze, caught in a specific moment of specific experience. It is not a symbol. It is a person. And behind all of this, enabling it, funding it, providing the commercial infrastructure without which the artists could not have worked and the ideas could not have spread, was the money. The Medici Bank, the commercial networks of Venice and Genoa, the wool trade of Florence, the spice trade of Portugal, the silver mines of Bohemia, the accumulated commercial sophistication of 2 centuries of medieval trade, concentrated in the hands of families who understood that investment in art and architecture was not merely aesthetic pleasure but political power, the demonstration of wealth and cultivation that transformed a merchant family into a dynasty. Lorenzo de' Medici, il Magnifico, the Magnificent, who ruled Florence in the late 15th century, was simultaneously a banker and a poet and a patron and a political operator of ruthless effectiveness, a man who embodied in his own person the synthesis of commercial, political, and cultural power that the Italian Renaissance represented at its height. He funded Botticelli and Michelangelo and Leonardo. He collected ancient manuscripts and ancient sculptures. He wrote poetry in Italian that was technically accomplished and personally felt. He ran a banking network that extended across Europe. He was not a medieval man. He was not quite a modern man. He was something in between, something that the medieval world had made possible and that pointed beyond itself towards something that had not yet arrived. The medieval world was ending. And in its ending, it was giving birth to everything that followed. Stand for a moment at the edge of the 15th century and look back. 1,000 years. From the moment that Odoacer sent Romulus Augustulus into his comfortable exile and the Western Roman Empire simply ceased to have a Western emperor, to the moment that Henry Tudor placed the crown on his head on Bosworth Field and Lorenzo de' Medici walked through the gardens of his villa filled with ancient statues and Gutenberg's presses were running in Mainz and Portuguese ships were rounding the Cape of Good Hope. 1,000 years. What had the medieval world made? It had made nations. France and England and Spain and Portugal, not yet the fully developed nation-states of the modern world, but recognizable ancestors of them. Communities of shared identity organized around shared territory and shared governance, and the beginning of shared law. The idea that a defined people living in a defined territory has the right to govern itself. This idea, which we take so completely for granted that it is invisible to us, was a medieval invention. Not a deliberate one. Not a planned one. But an invention nonetheless, hammered out in the specific conditions of feudal fragmentation and royal centralization and national warfare that the medieval period produced. It had made law. The common law of England, the Roman law that the Italian universities had recovered and transmitted to the rest of Europe, the canon law of the Church, the commercial law of the Italian trading cities. These were not Roman law or Greek law. They were medieval achievements, built on ancient foundations but elaborated and refined and made practically functional in the specific conditions of medieval society. The idea that disputes should be resolved by the application of known rules rather than by the arbitrary will of the powerful. This idea is ancient in origin and medieval in its practical development into something that actually worked for large populations across large territories. It had made the university. Those extraordinary institutions, Oxford and Cambridge and Paris and Bologna and Salamanca, that had been refining the tools of systematic rational inquiry since the 12th century, that had produced the trained lawyers and theologians and physicians and philosophers who were the intellectual infrastructure of the emerging nation-states. That had transmitted and developed and argued over the heritage of classical learning until it was ready to produce, in the Renaissance, something new. It had made the vernacular literatures. Dante in Italian, Chaucer in English, the troubadours in Occitan, the Minzingers in German. The medieval world had developed literature in the languages that people actually spoke, had taken the vernacular seriously as a vehicle for the highest literary expression, had laid the foundations on which Shakespeare and Cervantes and Montaigne and all the great writers of the following centuries would build. It had made the cathedral. Those extraordinary structures, Chartres and Notre Dame and Salisbury and Cologne and the dozens of others that still rise above European cities, were the medieval world's most enduring physical achievement. They were built by communities, funded by faith, designed by master craftsmen whose names we know and by thousands of laborers whose names we don't. They embodied, in stone and glass and the mathematics of structural engineering, a particular understanding of the relationship between the human and the divine that was the medieval world's most sustained meditation on its own deepest beliefs. It had made chivalry, imperfect, hypocritical, honored more in the breach than in the observance, but real in its aspiration toward a moral framework for the exercise of violence, real in the literature it produced, real in the genuine moments when knights did protect the weak and honor their oaths and fight for something larger than themselves. It had made the banking system and the letter of credit and the basic institutions of European capitalism, not deliberately, not as a project, but as a practical response to the commercial needs of a trading world that needed to move money across large distances safely and efficiently. It had survived the Black Death. This deserves to be said separately, because it is not obvious that it should have been possible. The loss of a third of the population in 5 years is a catastrophe of a scale that should, by any rational projection, have been civilization ally fatal. It was not. The civilization bent. It changed. It emerged traumatized and different. But it emerged. It kept going. The fields were replanted and the workshops reopened and the children were born and the books were written and the cathedrals were finished and the ships were sent out into unknown oceans. The persistence of human civilization in the face of catastrophe, the stubborn, unreasonable, magnificent refusal to stop, is perhaps the most important thing the medieval world demonstrates. And now, standing at the edge of the 15th century, looking at the printing presses and the ocean-going ships and the Renaissance paintings and the embryonic nation-states and the universities and the banks, looking at all of it, it is possible to see something that the people living through it could not quite see from the inside. The medieval world had been building towards something. Not intentionally. Not according to any plan. Through the accumulation of practical solutions to immediate problems, through the slow refinement of institutions across generations, through the accidents of war and plague and dynastic succession and individual genius. Through the patient labor of monks copying manuscripts and master masons pushing stone to the edge of its capacity and merchants developing credit instruments, and kings extending their jurisdiction and peasants insisting on their customary rights. Through all of this, the medieval world had been building the infrastructure, institutional, intellectual, cultural, economic, on which the modern world would be constructed. The Reformation was coming. Martin Luther was a child in Saxony, not yet aware of what he would become. The scientific revolution was coming. Copernicus and Galileo and Newton were still in the future, their discoveries unimaginable to anyone living in 1485. The great colonial empires were beginning. Columbus would sail in 7 years, and the world would never be the same. But the foundations had been laid. The tools had been made. The habits of mind had been developed, the habit of rational inquiry, the habit of legal reasoning, the habit of thinking about the individual as a person with rights rather than simply a subject with duties, the habit of imagining that the world could be different from what it had always been. These were medieval achievements. And the world that was coming, for all its newness, for all its revolutionary rupture with the past, would not have been possible without them. The castles are ruins now. The feudal obligations have been gone for centuries. The particular form of Christianity that organized every aspect of medieval life has been transformed beyond recognition. The knights are legend. The Crusades are history. The plague has been conquered, the bacterium identified, the transmission understood, the antibiotic treatment developed that would have saved millions of lives if it had existed in 1347. But the nations are still there. The universities are still there. The cathedrals are still there. The law is still there, transformed, elaborated, extended in ways that a medieval lawyer would find extraordinary, but recognizably descended from the same roots, still organized around the same fundamental principle that disputes should be resolved by the application of known rules rather than arbitrary power. The road that Rome built is still there too, in places. Still running straight across the landscape, its stones worn smooth by 1,000 years of feet. Still pointing somewhere. The medieval world is gone. What it built remains. And we, living in the nations it created, educated in the universities it founded, governed by the laws it developed, reading in the languages it refined, worshipping in some cases in the cathedrals it raised, carrying in our minds the habits of thought it slowly, painfully cultivated, we are, in ways that are easy to miss because they are too close to see, its inheritors. The world Rome left behind became the world that burned and was reborn. And the world that was reborn became, in time, the world we live in. It is enough. It is more than enough. The story of the medieval world, that long, violent, beautiful, terrible, magnificent 1,000 years between the fall of one civilization and the birth of another, is not over. It never ends. It simply becomes us.